At the beginning of Chapter 1, it was raining. The sky had been clear when Alvin departed, yet he wondered if even the weather hated him. He remembered the moment he had been asked to leave the party. He had been seated at the table at the time and had asked his leader why. The man adjusted his glasses before stating that he imagined even Alvin had already predicted the reason. Alvin wondered how many times he had been expelled from a party by then. After being expelled, he sat for a while in the middle of the forest. Later, he continued onward until the sun rose. Looking up, he realized there was nobody around. Usually, there would at least be a peddler nearby. He thought it was only natural for people to avoid the area once they heard that rumor. He looked at his status screen, knowing this was reckless. He prepared potions, antidotes, food, and spare equipment. Then something glowed. Even so, if he intended to continue living as an adventurer, this was his only choice. He had no choice but to defeat the boss by himself. After entering the dungeon, he looked ahead and found flavor text carved into the stone. It bore the title The Elder's Reply. It stated that the elder's body had weakened, his holy sword had rusted, and even his mind for casting magical techniques had withered away. Parts of the inscription were blacked out, and it also mentioned the setting sun cave. Alvin found it certainly evocative, but lingering at the entrance would accomplish nothing, so he decided to move forward. He entered the first floor of the setting sun cave, the shallow layer. To him, parameters, skills, and magic were meaningless outside dungeons. The reason for this was unknown, but that was simply how the world worked. Outside the dungeon, he was merely a 19-year-old boy. Inside, however, he was different. To put it bluntly, he was strong. He was exploring an area normally reached only by adventurers old enough to consider retirement. After progressing deeper, he arrived at floor 11, the medium layer. Alvin possessed many skills that were advantageous in battle, allowing him to demonstrate abilities beyond his own level. He was a prodigy whom nobody could hope to surpass as the vanguard of a party. He continued to the 17th floor, the middle layer. Even then, he was thinking that this was only true if one factor was ignored. His thoughts were interrupted when he noticed a paralyzing slime. It took time to defeat, its paralyzing liquid attack was troublesome, and it was relatively large. However, it dropped a large number of coins. Its weakness, the core, was notoriously difficult to destroy in a single strike, but by closing the distance and baiting it into a jumping attack, he could target the instant it stretched and thinned the mucus protecting it. He killed it. The raiding techniques he had developed generally worked like this. He waited for the drops, but his eyes widened when there were none, not even a single one. His thoughts returned to the day his leader had revealed that the party had already found a swordsman to replace him. Alvin had paused before insisting that he was a high-level adventurer with far more skills than anyone else and that the party needed those as well. His leader had questioned whether Alvin truly wanted to bring up his skill count. He then told Alvin to open his status and display the tabs. He directed Alvin's attention to the very bottom of the skill sheet that he had been so proud of. Alvin navigated through his status screen. At the bottom was the skill drop rate reduction special. Its effect stated that the possessor suffered an 80% reduction in item drop rate when delivering the finishing blow to monsters. However, that restriction did not apply to boss drop. The number and type of skills a person was born with were beyond anyone's control, and those blessed with many skills paid a price in return. They were forced to bear a cursed skill known as a minus skill. The effects of Alvin's minus skill were simple. If an ordinary adventurer dealt the finishing blow to 10 monsters, they would receive roughly 1 drop for every 10 kills. With Alvin's status, he would receive only 1 drop for every 50. In other words, the more he participated in battle, the more the party's income from monster drops declined. It was only natural for others to resent him. Being expelled from parties was inevitable. He could accept all of that. Even so, he felt gloomy. He had become an adventurer at the age of 14 and had continued leveling alone for a time because he needed enough power to offset his minus skill. Thanks to his other skills, Alvin leveled up rapidly and was able to join parties. However, he was always kicked out. He also studied how to give away finishing blows and adapt to different situations. Alvin believed he had put in incredible effort in his own way. Rather, he took pride in having worked harder than anyone else. Even so, he was completely unable to overcome his minus skill. He sighed, wishing everything in this world could be resolved through effort alone. Suddenly, he heard a scream. At first, he assumed it belonged to a monster, but he quickly realized it was the scream of a person. The sound came from ahead, where someone was clearly engaged in battle. He spotted a group of yellow-skinned monsters. They were yellow goblins. Depending on an adventurer's level, that number alone could be deadly. Alvin immediately drew his sword and charged toward them. What he found was a lone girl. Judging by her equipment, she was a priestess. He rushed straight through the enemies, cutting down every goblin in his path. He asked whether she could still move and whether she had any MP remaining. She confirmed that she could. Alvin instructed her to stand up first and correct her stance. She apologized for causing him trouble, but Alvin brushed it aside, reminding her that if she was an adventurer as well, then they were in the same situation. The girl was deeply moved. Alvin told her to heal herself first and then concentrate on protecting herself. He urged himself to hurry. The absence of the girl's party members concerned him. He continued fighting the goblins, cutting them down one after another. Without his noticing, one goblin drew its bow and released an arrow toward him. Alvin activated parry, and the arrow was immediately knocked down to the ground. Another horde of goblins appeared. Alvin wondered if they intended to overwhelm him with sheer numbers. No matter how many he defeated, more goblins rushed forward. He muttered that the goblins were underestimating someone who had originally fought alone. Alvin then activated Zentetsu, slicing the larger goblins cleanly in half. One smaller goblin managed to slip past him. He warned the priestess that the last one was heading toward her. She quickly crushed its head. Alvin noticed the monster drop. The priestess smiled, believing they had successfully defeated the goblins. After reaching a safe point, one of the many secure areas inside the dungeon, the priestess thanked Alvin. She introduced herself as Kokol, a priestess. Alvin introduced himself as a swordsman. He asked why Kokol had been alone, wondering if the rest of her party had been wiped out. Before he could finish, she explained that her party had not collapsed because she had been exploring solo from the beginning. Alvin asked if that was really true. It was the first time he had ever seen a priestess on her own. Kokol admitted that she had been unable to find anyone willing to form a party with her. Alvin remarked that this was exactly the problem and that she was being far too reckless. Kokol paused as though she wanted to say something, but ultimately decided to leave it unsaid. Instead, she opened her status screen, believing it would be easier for him to see for himself. Alvin complained that she should not reveal her detailed status to someone she had only just met. Kokol replied that she did not mind. Alvin's eyes widened when he saw that Kokol was level 80. Alvin felt embarrassed and wondered if his help had been completely unnecessary. Kokol quickly reassured him that he had truly saved her life. It had been the first time she had ever been caught off guard while exploring solo and had fallen into despair. More importantly, she wanted him to look at her skill sheet. Alvin commented that she had many skills. Kokol replied that she possessed 11 and gratefully accepted the compliment. He read through them, noting enhanced healing magic, MP boost, MED, and God of Love's protection, remarking that they were all excellent skills. At the bottom, however, he noticed a skill named Usurper of the Severed Head. Alvin admitted that he had never heard of it. Kokol explained that it was her minus skill. She further explained that Usurper of the Severed Head was the minus skill that had allowed her level to rise so high. Alvin asked whether reaching level 80 was the result of its effect. Kokol confirmed that it was. The skill's effect was simple. Whenever another member of her party killed a monster, she was always treated as the one who had landed the killing blow. Alvin asked whether the actual person who defeated the monster still received experience and item drop. Kokol replied that they usually did. However, the greatest problem was the kill bonus. Alvin recalled that the adventurer who landed the finishing blow normally received triple the standard experience, and he realized that her skill allowed her to claim all of that bonus instead. Kokol explained that as long as the skill continued stealing experience for her, everyone else in the party would level more slowly. Alvin finally understood why she had been expelled from parties. He suggested that she could instead join a party focused on gathering items, where safety was more important than leveling, and believed that a high-level healer like her would still be valuable. Kokol interrupted him, explaining that the additional penalty of Usurper of the Severed Head made even that impossible. Alvin was shocked to learn there was another penalty. Kokol explained that any skills possessed by the party members who landed the killing blow, such as increased experience gain or increased drop rate, became indefinite. The full description on her status read that Usurper of the Severed Head treated the possessor as the killer whenever a party member defeated a monster, and that skills whose effects activated after a kill became indefinite. The skill not only stole another person's experience but also rendered their kill-triggered skills useless. Alvin realized this was the point where he should have comforted her, but he could not. Kokol apologized for suddenly telling him all of this, but she wanted to ask him something. She asked whether he had heard the rumor that the boss of the Setting Sun Cave dropped an item capable of erasing skills. She had come in search of that item, but after reaching this point, she had begun to feel that defeating the boss alone would be impossible. She let out a small laugh. Deep down, however, Alvin felt as though he had overlooked something important. Skills that increased drop rate. Skills whose effects activated after a kill. They became indefinite. If an increased drop rate became indefinite, then what would happen to his own drop rate reduction special? He tried to calm himself. Kokol continued by saying that she intended to keep improving her abilities as an adventurer on her own, so there was no need for anyone to form a party with her. The skill erasing item was the only reward she wanted, and she would gladly let Alvin have everything else. She was about to ask him for that favor, believing it was an impolite request, but before she could continue, Alvin called her name. He sincerely asked her to form a party with him. Kokol questioned whether he had actually listened to anything she had said. In reality, he had missed most of it. Later, the two of them proceeded through the setting sun cave and arrived on floor 17, still within the medium layer. Kokol wondered whether they could not simply tackle the dungeon separately while remaining allied. Alvin told her not to worry about the effects of her minus skill on him. For now, she only needed to accompany him through 2 or 3 battles. Kokol agreed and asked whether he would like a buff. Hearing those words moved Alvin. The reassurance of having a companion seeped into the heart of someone who had long been a solitary outcast, almost bringing him to tears. He thought that parties truly were wonderful. Suddenly, Kokol called out to him. Alvin initially assumed it was still too early in the medium layer to be concerned, but she pointed ahead. Another paralyzing slime stood before them. He realized it was the perfect opportunity to test his theory. As the slime stretched its body, Alvin rushed in and struck. He hoped his hypothesis would prove correct. The moment the slime died, his jaw dropped. Coins poured out in abundance. Both he and Kokol stared in shock. Kokol was impressed that he had defeated the slime in a single hit and praised his remarkable skill. Alvin replied that he still could not be certain. Later, they fought a group of goblins. After defeating them, a yellow goblin antidote dropped. Kokol observed that the antidote appeared to have the same effect as a paralysis antidote potion and noted that it was rare. Alvin checked his status and concluded that it was still too early to be sure. He needed one more test. They later encountered an electric spider. Kokol was astonished when it dropped a lightning bolt. She remarked that Alvin was incredibly lucky. Alvin found it impossible to believe that his drops could truly be the result of luck. Kokol wondered why he looked so puzzled. Suddenly, Alvin called her name. Startled, Kokol apologized, wondering if she had been too annoying. Alvin asked her once again whether she would form a party with him. She reminded him that they were already in one. Remembering something, Alvin suddenly knelt before her. He asked her to stay with him forever from that moment onward, adding that he did not feel he could continue living without her. Flustered, Kokol pointed out that they had only just met. Alvin insisted that even so, she had already revealed everything to him, just as she had shown him her status. Kokol was left speechless. Alvin happily declared that their meeting had been destiny. She frantically wondered how he could say something like that when she still barely knew him. Alvin acknowledged that this was important. He admitted that he also possessed a minus skill. Kokol was surprised. Alvin explained that, unlike hers, his minus skill was not particularly uncommon. She looked at his status screen and was shocked to see drop rate reduction special. Kokol remarked that the special designation itself seemed unusual and praised Alvin for managing to continue life as an adventurer despite such a skill. Alvin told her that he had recently been expelled from yet another party. Kokol asked whether that was the reason he had come to the dungeon. He confirmed that it was. Like her, he had been seeking the boss drop capable of erasing skills. Kokol was confused because his drops had been appearing normally during their battles. Alvin explained that it was all thanks to her usurper of the severed head. She found it hard to believe, since that skill had only ever caused problems for others. Even in their recent battles, there had been no kill bonus, and the kill-triggered skills of the actual monster slayer had not activated. Alvin confirmed that this was exactly what had happened. Kokol's eyes widened as she realized what he meant. She wondered whether his skill had failed to activate because of her minus skill. Alvin confirmed that this was precisely the case. His drop rate reduction special no longer activated while they were in the same party. As long as they remained together, he could fight as a normal swordsman. Kokol finally understood. Perhaps it was simply a matter of perspective. Maybe Alvin had noticed the interaction only because he possessed such an unusual skill. She then realized that this was why he had asked to stay with her forever. Alvin confirmed that even after clearing the dungeon, he wanted to continue adventuring together with her. Kokol was left speechless. When Alvin asked what was wrong, she replied that nothing was wrong at all. Smiling, she reflected that even a skill like hers could have a purpose after all, and she was genuinely happy to hear it. She started to speak again but hesitated. Alvin said he understood her hesitation because he, too, had caused trouble for many parties because of his skill. Therefore, she did not need to force herself to answer him immediately. At the very least, he hoped they could remain in the same party until they finished this dungeon. Kokol extended her hand and agreed. Though it might only be for a short while, she hoped they would get along well. Alvin accepted her hand and hoped for the same. At the beginning of Chapter 2, Alvin and Kokol reached the 24th floor. Alvin defeated the monsters one after another before checking his status screen. He blushed at the thought that the day had finally come when his storage was filling with monster drops. He asked Kokol to help him collect them. All of this was possible because of the blessing of her skill. Although they had met only by chance, Kokol was truly a rare companion. As they continued, Alvin noticed that Kokol seemed restless. He wondered whether she was tired and suggested that they take a break. Kokol insisted that she was perfectly fine. Alvin earnestly reminded her that, even if their partnership was temporary, they were still members of the same party. If she had any concerns, she should tell him so they could resolve whatever they could. Coco blushed and stammered before realizing what had been bothering her. She admitted that Alvin had been defeating every monster in a single strike, leading her to assume he must be wielding some kind of unique sword. Alvin looked at her before drawing his weapon and showing her that it was simply an ordinary blade appropriate for his level. Coco pointed out that monsters such as paralyzing slimes were difficult to cut down so easily. Alvin explained that if he accurately struck their weaknesses, he could defeat monsters as strong as those in the medium layer with a single blow. On top of that, he was benefiting from Coco's strength enhancement buff. Coco blushed again, noting that even with her buff, Alvin had defeated every monster they had encountered in a single hit, which still seemed unusual. Alvin accepted it as a compliment. He explained that he had devoted himself to studying combat techniques so he would not burden others because of his minus skill, even though he was still expelled from parties. To be honest, he felt that he simply wanted to show off a little in front of Coco. He added that she was a precious companion whom he had happened to meet and that he wanted to make sure she would not give up on him if he turned out to be a weak vanguard. Coco was left speechless. Her shoulders slumped as she quietly realized that everything came back to that once again. A short while later, she noticed something ahead. They approached a treasure chest, and Coco wondered whether it might be a mimic. Alvin asked her to let him open it. He told her to stand back and said he would be relying on her if it turned out to be a trap. Coco agreed. Alvin reflected that he always hesitated a little when dealing with situations like this while exploring alone, but having a healer supporting him from behind was incredibly reassuring. When he opened the chest, he found a scroll. After unfolding it, he wondered whether it contained text that further reinforced the rumors surrounding the boss drop. Written on it was a passage stating that the blank had caused its user to part with one of their gifts. Since his minus skill was currently being nullified, Alvin was not concerned for himself, but obtaining the skill-erasing item had been their objective from the beginning. Coco noticed the expression on his face and called out to him. Alvin turned to her. Coco told him that if only one person could use the boss drop item, then he should be the one to use it. Alvin was surprised and wondered why she had suddenly said that. Coco explained that she had been thinking about it. Since it was a rare item with an unprecedented effect, she believed there was a possibility that only one person could use it. If that happened, she would owe Alvin for saving her. Alvin realized that the reason she had seemed so downcast was because she had been worrying about exactly this. He told her that he thought they should simply sell the item instead. Coco was surprised and wondered why. Alvin explained that, more than experience or anything else, what he truly wanted was a companion willing to continue adventuring with him. As long as Coco remained by his side, he could overcome the effects of his minus skill, and his level was already high enough. He had absolutely no complaints about remaining as he was. Coco thanked him and asked whether those had truly been his honest feelings. She then pointed out that if she continued taking away his experience, and if his efforts were never rewarded in a tangible way, his dissatisfaction would inevitably grow. That had always been what happened before. Alvin finally understood. Minus skills were ultimately a matter of emotion. He had heard people say something similar in the past, but only now did he truly grasp its meaning. Jealousy, suspicion, and servility, minus skills consumed both their possessors and their companions, drawing out their negative emotions. Up until now, Alvin realized, he had probably worn the same expression that Coco did. He called out to the downcast Coco and asked her to listen to him as someone who lived under the same circumstances. Kneeling before her, he vowed that he would never betray her. Silence followed. Alvin looked at her and began to panic, wondering whether he had said too much about his own situation. He hurriedly added that there was no guarantee the boss drop could only be used by one person and that they should only worry about that after they had actually obtained it. Coco agreed. She bowed her head and apologized for saying something strange. Alvin assured her that there was no need to apologize. He then suggested that they continue onward and Coco agreed. Together, they resumed exploring the dungeon. As they walked, Coco could not help thinking that Alvin was truly an upright person. He had suddenly appeared before her on the same floor of the same dungeon, an adventurer blessed with both remarkable ability and admirable character. She felt that he might be the person capable of helping her. Before she realized it, she had opened up to him about her minus skill. She began to think that perhaps this encounter really had been fate. Even so, it all felt too good to be true. Alvin wanted to form a party with someone burdened by a minus skill simply because they shared the same circumstances. Unlike every adventurer she had met before, however, she had no guarantee that he would never change his mind. As long as she possessed Usurper of the Severed Head, that fear remained. Then she remembered Alvin's promise that he would never betray her. The darkness within her heart began to crack. Whatever awaited her from this point onward, she felt certain that everything would be all right as long as she remained with Alvin. Her eyes suddenly widened. She alerted Alvin to something ahead. Alvin recognized the sounds of battle and realized it was no ordinary fight. He decided they should investigate. Apologizing to Kokol, he asked her to follow him. She did so as they hurried toward the source of the commotion. They saw what lay ahead. Alvin wondered why so many golems had gathered in one place. Kokol observed that there appeared to be adventurers trapped inside. Alvin assessed the situation and questioned whether it was too much for them to handle. After a brief moment, he decided to engage as many of the golems as he could. Kokol stopped him, telling him to receive a buff first. Alvin then activated Zantetsu and struck one of the golems. He clicked his tongue before drawing his sword once more. As expected, golems were extremely durable. Behind him, Kokol apologized for being slow. Alvin told her to cast the buff on him. He had already drawn the monster's attention. Kokol agreed. Emerald golems possessed strong resistance to physical attacks, making them a poor matchup for swordsmen. Zantetsu alone would not easily break through their defenses, but Alvin was clearly using it as both a distraction and a means of repositioning quickly. Kokol was struck by the speed and precision of his decisions. She could barely keep pace with her own chanting. Against such a large group of golems, she realized that a simple strength enhancement would not be the most effective support. Another buff would contribute far more to their damage output. Although its duration was short, considering Alvin's abilities, she genuinely wanted to support him with everything she had rather than merely accommodating him. As Alvin leaped into the air, he was startled by the effect of the spell. Kokol had granted him a physical resistance penetration buff. It was the first time he had ever received such an advanced enhancement. With that buff, the golem's weak point would no longer be protected by its physical resistance. Alvin drove his sword into the golem. Its body cracked apart before crumbling into pieces. After landing on the ground, he told Kokol that the buff had truly allowed him to ignore the monster's resistance completely. They would be able to save a great deal of time that way, and he would be relying on her from then on. Kokol agreed and thanked him, adding that Alvin's ability to strike the golem's weak point had been equally impressive. At the beginning of Chapter 3, someone asked whether Alvin and Kokol were really only a temporary party. Alvin explained that he had met Kokol on the 17th floor and invited her to join him. The other person was surprised, remarking that it was quite bold of him to pick up a girl. The girl's name was Melina. She explained that they were probably curious about her minus skill. It was called God of Envy's Divine Protection. Because of that skill, she had never been able to form a party. Although she was a sorceress, she always explored alone. Alvin asked what kind of effect her minus skill had. Melina noticed his genuine interest, finding it unusual. Since the skill had no effect while she was solo, she explained it under the assumption that she was in a party. First, all party members, including herself, received a 10% increase to their stat. Kokol remarked that it sounded extraordinary. Melina replied that the disadvantages began after that. The second effect reduced the stats of the party member who landed a killing blow by 3% whenever they defeated a monster. This reduction was treated as a debuff and accumulated with each kill. Alvin considered the implications, wondering whether someone who defeated 40 monsters would suffer a 120% reduction, even after accounting for the initial increase, effectively reducing their stats to 0. Melina explained that it did not work that way. Using one of their current stats as an example, she described how the 10% increase was gradually offset by the 3% reduction for each kill. After 3 kills, the initial increase was effectively gone, and from the 4th kill onward, the reduction began affecting the user's base stats. Assuming a strength value of 100, the total reduction after 40 kills would amount to roughly 70%. However, because the reduction counted as a debuff, it gradually wore off over time rather than stacking permanently. As a result, it rarely fell low enough to completely cripple someone's combat ability. Alvin concluded that the minus skill did not seem all that terrible. Melina disagreed, explaining that the truly devastating part was the third effect. Alvin was surprised to learn there was yet another effect. Melina admitted that it was somewhat complicated and asked them to ignore the 10% stat increase for the moment. The third effect caused the kill bonus earned by the adventurer who landed the finishing blow to be divided equally among the other members of the party. She illustrated the effect with an example in which a swordsman had 2 kills, a sorceress had 1 kill, and a priestess had none. The result was that the kill bonus was seized from the actual killers and redistributed to the rest of the party. In summary, God of Envy's Divine Protection increased every party member's stats by 10%. At the same time, whenever a party member defeated a monster, that person's stats were reduced by 3%, and the experience bonus normally awarded for the killing blow was evenly distributed among the other party members instead. Melina explained that because the debuff activated whenever someone landed a finishing blow, reducing both their stats and removing their kill bonus, the party had to change the way it fought. Alvin concluded that everyone would try to let someone else deliver the final blow. Melina confirmed that this was exactly what happened. Frontline fighters could no longer freely finish off enemies, creating dangerous situations that often led to accidents. Inside a dungeon, no matter how spectacular an attack appeared, taking damage merely reduced a person's HP. Their combat performance did not deteriorate simply because they had been injured. When performance did decline, it was usually the result of debuff. Melina did not know why the world worked that way, but that was simply how it was. She explained that someone under attack could unexpectedly lose a large amount of HP and have it drop to 0. Once HP reached 0, death was absolute. No healing magic or item could revive a corpse. In reality, it had been horrifying to watch party members repeatedly compete over finishing blows before dealing with wounded monsters. As a rear guard, Melina also required time to chant her spells. It was impossible for her to support everyone through every dangerous situation. Time and again, she had witnessed reckless attacks that nearly caused her parties to collapse. Ultimately, the situation would always become too dangerous, and Melina would either be expelled from the party or choose to leave on her own. Alvin understood why it was better for her to explore alone. Melina explained that she did not want to die because of her own minus skill. Even so, she admitted that remaining solo was only better in theory. In the end, exploring alone was still dangerous. That was why she had come to the Setting Sun Cave after hearing the rumor that its boss dropped an item capable of erasing skills. She had already mapped out a route to reach the boss. Alvin realized that Melina's minus skill was directly tied to her survival. Even so, something continued to bother him. If he landed the finishing blow himself, he did not need the kill bonus, so he would not mind if it were taken away or redistributed. As he thought about it further, he began considering what would happen if someone landed a killing blow within their current party. Melina explained that trapping and hunting emerald golems was simply a way to earn funds for future battles. She intended to hire backup only when she was ready to challenge the boss. Otherwise, there could be problems if she failed to establish a contract through payment. Before she could continue, Kokol's expression changed. Melina's explanation was interrupted when Kokol suddenly called her name and immediately asked her to form a party with them. Melina stared at her in shock and questioned whether Kokol had actually listened to everything she had just explained. Kokol replied that she had. Melina pointed out that if the swordsman hesitated over landing the finishing blow because of her minus skill, he would also be placing himself in danger. Alvin hesitated at first, but then decided they should simply try it for the time being. Kokol eagerly urged Melina to give it a chance. Flustered, Melina finally agreed, though she could not understand what had come over Kokol. Later, the three of them arrived on the 24th floor. Melina asked what they intended to do. Kokol explained that they were going to test their current party by defeating a monster together. After checking his status, Alvin saw that every one of his stats had increased by 10%. Melina wondered whether they intended to level up, since even non-combatants constantly received experience bonuses under her minus skill. Before she could continue, Kokol replied that she did not need to level up and that she most likely would not receive any kill bonuses either. Just then, an enemy appeared. It was a tentacle plant. Melina told them to leave it to her, confident that she could dispose of it instantly. She swung her staff. Alvin was impressed by the incredible speed of her chanting. Standing before the tentacle plant, Melina completed her spell and unleashed her magic. The tentacle plant was immediately engulfed in flames. Seeing that the tentacle plant had been defeated in a single blow, Alvin remarked that it was incredible. Melina replied that, despite appearances, she was already level 38. She began explaining that attacking an enemy with the attribute it was weak against was effective, but Kokol interrupted by asking what kinds of attributes Melina could use. Melina answered that she primarily used 5 attribute. By level 38, she had learned every spell available to her. Before she could continue, Kokol reacted in amazement. She pointed out that reaching such a high level was already impressive, but mastering 5 primary attributes was even more extraordinary. Melina wondered what was so surprising and remarked that Kokol was remarkable as well. Kokol hurriedly explained that spellcasters had an enormous variety of spells depending on the attributes and incantations they learned, all of which were different. As a sorcerer's level increased, the number of spells expanded dramatically. Most spellcasters focused on only the attributes best suited to their skills and staff abilities. Even Alvin recalled that his former party leader had only used 3 attribute. Kokol explained that Melina possessing 5 different A+ attribute-enhancing skills meant she must have an incredible memory. Alvin was shocked when he realized that Melina had genuinely memorized all of those spell incantations. Melina explained that, for some reason, she had been born with 5 different attribute-enhancing skills and had not wanted to waste them, so she had desperately studied every spell she could learn. Kokol admitted that her own abilities were completely filled with priestess magic, leaving her with nothing but admiration for Melina. Melina replied that when exploring alone, it was best to attack enemies with as many attributes as possible to exploit their weaknesses. Alvin reflected that being a solo sorceress was far from an ideal occupation, yet Melina had devoted an extraordinary amount of effort to making it work. Kokol then remembered to check their party status. Looking at the status screen, she noticed a debuff labeled endowed by Melina's god of envy's divine protection. Pointing at the display, she asked whether the icon shaped like a melting heart represented the effect. It was the first time she had ever seen one. Melina confirmed that it was called God of Envy's Curse and explained that it had appeared on her after she defeated the tentacle plant. As Alvin and Kokol continued examining the status screen, Kokol realized that all of Melina's stats had been reduced by 3%. Melina confirmed that this was normally what happened. However, she suddenly became confused because she had not actually felt the effect take hold. Kokol suggested that they fight another battle for now. Later, they encountered an emerald golem, making it their next target. Alvin noted that this one was not trapped, so leaving everything to the rear guard alone would be impossible. He decided to join the fight. The emerald golem swung its fist as Alvin rushed forward. Suddenly, a blast of magic struck its shoulder. Alvin was surprised by the magical support before realizing that the attack had knocked the golem backward. A knockback occurred when damage exceeded a certain threshold and interrupted an enemy's action. He was impressed that a single spell had dealt enough damage to trigger such an effect. Alvin immediately dashed toward the golem, delivering a heavy slash that severed its head. The emerald golem crumbled apart. Alvin quietly realized that he had managed to defeat it even without a physical resistance penetration buff. Melina's attack had reduced its HP enough for a single heavy strike to finish it. Melina praised Alvin's movements, remarking that he was clearly a high-level adventurer as well. She had expected it to take several more attacks. Alvin replied that he was probably not as high-level as the remarkable priestess standing nearby. Kokol had turned her back to them and was fidgeting while staring at the status screen. Alvin asked what she had found. Still checking the display, she quietly muttered that it was not there. Melina asked what she meant. With complete determination, Kokol suddenly asked Melina to form a party with them. It was the second time she had asked that day. Startled, Melina pointed out that they were already in a party. Kokol immediately realized that she was right. She reached out and took Melina's hand before asking her to stay with her forever from that moment onward. Overwhelmed, Kokol found herself unable to put the rest of her feelings into words. Melina became flustered and admitted that the request put her in a difficult position. Kokol had suddenly said something like that, and they were both women. Kokol was taken aback as she realized that she had said the same thing to Alvin earlier. Alvin wondered whether she had really done that. Embarrassed, Kokol corrected herself and asked whether Melina would be willing to remain in a party with them even after they left the setting sun cave. Melina's eyes widened. After a brief pause to compose herself, she explained that she had already said she could not join any party. Kokol asked whether Alvin minded. Alvin replied that he did not. Kokol then admitted that both she and Alvin also possessed minus skills. Together, they explained their circumstances to Melina. After listening, Melina reflected on Usurper of the Severed Head, remarking that its effect was difficult to believe. Even so, if it were not true, Kokol could not possibly have reached level 80. She then noticed that Alvin was level 43. Alvin explained that reaching that level had been necessary so he could obtain item drops normally. Melina said she finally understood their situation. It seemed that all three of them had come to the dungeon for the same reason. However, if they were merely sympathizing with her, she would only accept their goodwill. She intended to continue doing things her own way. Kokol replied that it was not sympathy. Instead, she asked Melina to look first at her own status and then at the party status. Melina opened her status screen. The God of Envy's curse was nowhere to be found. She was then shocked to discover that she had received the tentacle plant's kill bonus. Confused, she wondered what was happening. Her surprise deepened when she saw that Kokol was carrying 2 stacks of God of Envy's curse. Kokol asked whether Melina remembered the effect of Usurper of the Severed Head. Melina recalled that whenever a party member defeated a monster, the kill was treated as though Kokol had landed the finishing blow. Kokol confirmed that this was correct. She explained that the negative effect of God of Envy's divine protection was applied to whoever was treated as the killer. Since Usurper of the Severed Head made every kill count as Kokol's, all of the negative effects were redirected to her instead. As a result, the stolen experience from the Emerald Golem's kill bonus and the Tentacle Plant's kill bonus was redistributed to the other party members through God of Envy's divine protection, effectively returning the experience she would otherwise have taken from them. Melina finally understood. She pointed out that, under those conditions, Kokol would never receive another kill bonus. Kokol replied that she did not mind. Melina then observed that Alvin would not receive kill bonuses either, since they would always be divided evenly, giving him no advantage for landing the finishing blow. Alvin admitted that he actually preferred it that way. No single person deserved all the credit for defeating a monster. Even the Emerald Golem he had killed earlier had only fallen because of Melina's support. Melina was deeply moved. She then reminded them of one remaining problem. The God of Envy's curse, which should normally have been spread among the party's combatants, would instead accumulate entirely on Kokol. Her stats would decrease by 3% each time, with the effect stacking. Kokol fell silent for a moment before explaining that she possessed Clear, a spell that removed status effects. If the accumulated debuffs became too severe, she could simply erase them. Melina was surprised and asked whether it was the spell that removed buffs as well. She pointed out that its casting time was long, making it difficult to use in the middle of battle. Kokol assured her that it would be fine. She was already level 80, and even if her stats were cut in half, she would still be stronger than an ordinary priestess. She promised that she would fulfill her role as the party's healer. Melina asked why they had chosen her when the arrangement only placed Alvin and Kokol at a disadvantage. Kokol answered that she no longer wanted to continue stealing the fruits of another person's efforts. Until now, she had never been able to return the experience she had taken from others, and she had genuinely felt ashamed that she alone continued leveling up. Unlike that burden, debuffs could be managed through ingenuity. Melina blushed. Alvin then suggested that she try staying with the party a little longer. They still needed to find a way to conquer the dungeon and earn money, and traveling as a party was much safer than exploring alone. He asked what she thought. After considering it for a moment, Melina agreed. She admitted that it might only be for a short while, but she hoped she would get along well with Alvin and Kokol. Kokol happily took Melina's hands in excitement. Alvin shook Melina's hand and expressed the same hope. At the beginning of Chapter 4, the party reached the 32nd floor, a deep layer. There, Alvin engaged another golem in battle. He struck the enemy before noticing that one of the monsters had slipped away. He asked Melina if she could handle it. Melina told him to leave it to her. Spinning her staff, she unleashed lightning magic and electrocuted the monster. After the battle, Alvin let out a relieved sigh. Kokol praised everyone for their excellent work. They gathered around the monster drops. Alvin picked one up and noticed that they had obtained something different this time. Melina recognized it as a merman's tear, a rather rare gemstone. Kokol remarked that Alvin truly was a lucky person. Alvin examined the gem more closely before deciding that Melina should have it. She was startled and immediately refused, saying she could not accept such a valuable item. Alvin reminded her that they had interrupted her emerald golem trapping hunt earlier. Melina remembered the incident. Alvin had suddenly shouted that he would deal with the golems. She had been shocked to discover that other adventurers were nearby and had tried to tell him that everything was under control. However, the golems had abandoned her trap, and she had ended up trying to call out that she had finally managed to gather them all. Returning to the present, Melina stepped forward and told Alvin not to worry about her because the gem belonged to him. Alvin was about to object, but Melina insisted. If they accepted the gem from him, it would imply that his attempt to help her had only caused trouble. Then, the next time Alvin tried to save someone, he might hesitate for even a moment because of that concern. Melina admitted that she did not want him to fall behind because of such doubt. He had simply done the right thing. Alvin thought that Melina was an unusually logical person. He accepted her reasoning and agreed to keep the gem. Melina immediately noticed his reaction and asked whether he had just been thinking that she was overly rational. Alvin denied it, saying he would not go that far. Melina insisted that the thought had crossed his mind. Alvin defended himself by saying that he did not consider it a problem. Kokol giggled, observing that Melina seemed genuinely concerned about it. Embarrassed, Melina became flustered. The party continued onward. Alvin remarked that the dungeon was surprisingly deep. Kokol agreed. Alvin added that in a dungeon of this size, the boss room would normally be found somewhere in the lower half of the floors. Kokol pointed out that no cartographers sold maps of the deeper layers. Melina wondered how much farther the dungeon continued and admitted that she was beginning to worry. Alvin suggested taking a short break on the upper floor since they had no idea when they would find the next safe point. Melina asked whether they were already tired. She said she herself was fine before asking about Kokol. Melina reminded her that her stats had been steadily decreasing because of God of Envy's divine protection and wondered whether she was pushing herself too hard. Kokol replied that a few more battles would not bother her. Alvin and Melina could only conclude that Kokol was simply too strong. Kokol admitted that she was simply happy not to be receiving any kill bonus experience, and she let out a small laugh. Melina complained that the things Kokol found enjoyable were far beyond ordinary. Kokol then asked Alvin whether serving as the party's sole vanguard was becoming a burden. Alvin replied that he had reliable healing and another source of primary firepower supporting him. Thanks to his exceptional rear guard, fighting had become surprisingly easy. On top of that, his minus skill was now nullified, allowing him to receive kill bonuses again. If anything, he felt that he should be the one apologizing for benefiting the most. Kokol told him there was nothing to apologize for. Melina agreed, adding that although Alvin was a swordsman, he was also serving as an excellent shield for the party. Alvin blushed and admitted that he was happy to hear that he was fulfilling his role well. A moment later, he noticed something ahead. Kokol asked what had caught his attention. Alvin explained that there was another piece of flavor text carved above them. Kokol said she could not see it. Since Alvin was taller than both of them, she asked him to read it aloud. Alvin examined the inscription. It stated that the might of the swordsman wielding his great blade would eventually wither, and that the eyes of the archer's falcon, which surveyed the world from afar, would eventually grow dim. Even so, though those blanks would become blank, they would eventually be sharpened. Kokol noticed that Melina was carefully writing everything down. Melina remarked that the inscription resembled the text they had found at the dungeon entrance. She wondered whether it was meant to be read vertically before deciding that probably was not the case. Kokol questioned whether it might be a hint about the boss drop, though she was uncertain. Melina began thinking about the rumored boss drop. Dungeons appeared unpredictably throughout the world and disappeared once their boss was defeated. That meant there was only a single opportunity to obtain a dungeon boss's drop. It was something she would eventually have to confirm for herself, so she needed to pay close attention. She called to Alvin and asked whether he intended to defeat the boss. Alvin answered that he did. Since they had not exhausted themselves much so far, he intended to keep advancing at their current pace. Melina then asked what he planned to do with the boss drop item. Before she could continue, her expression turned pale. Kokol quietly realized that Melina was asking who should use the skill erasing item if it turned out to be unique and could only be used once. Melina admitted that this was essentially her concern. She considered the possibilities. The item might not be unique, nor necessarily limited to a single use. However, if one person could use it endlessly, minus skills would no longer exist anywhere in the world, which was clearly impossible. Perhaps it was a consumable item that disappeared after one use, with enough copies dropping to match the size of the party that defeated the boss. Yet, based on her experience, boss main drops were almost never consumable items. If that was not the case, perhaps it had a limited number of uses instead. Even then, the same question remained: how many times could it actually be used? Before Melina could think any further, Alvin and Kokol simultaneously remarked that they would worry about the matter only after they had defeated the boss. Melina was taken aback. She wondered whether the two of them had really only just met, as they were remarkably in sync. She questioned whether she might somehow be being deceived. Alvin replied that her concerns were completely understandable. He asked her to listen to their explanation first. Melina paused for a moment before agreeing. Alvin thanked her. Alvin explained that their circumstances were constantly changing. As they continued their raid, they might uncover new information or even have someone else defeat the boss before them. Because of that, he believed they should focus on what they could do now. The first priority was obtaining the boss drop. Melina acknowledged that Alvin had a point. Both Alvin and Kokol possessed not only impressive stats but also exceptional skill as adventurers, something she could recognize from both their actions and the way they spoke. She remembered Alvin saying that no single person deserved all the credit for a kill and that even the Emerald Golem he had defeated had only fallen because of Melina's support. She also recalled Kokol saying that she no longer wanted to continue reaping the rewards of another person's efforts. To Melina, neither of them resembled the sort of adventurer who put their own circumstances first and made unreasonable decisions. She began to think that if she stayed with the two of them, they might eventually arrive at a conclusion she could genuinely accept. Looking at Kokol, however, she found herself puzzled by the expression on her face. Recalling Alvin's suggestion to worry about the boss drop only after obtaining it, Melina agreed that it was the best approach. Besides, continuing onward seemed to be the shortest path toward their objective. Alvin replied that he would do everything he could to make that happen. Kokol added that she would also do her best so she could soon have something to worry about again. Melina could not help remarking that it sounded incredibly strange, and she burst into laughter. Kokol was surprised and wondered whether what she had said was really that odd. Melina realized that she genuinely wanted to continue adventuring with companions like these. There was probably no need to rationalize joining their party anymore. Alvin suggested that they begin by searching for the safe point on the current floor. Melina agreed. Suddenly, a scream echoed through the dungeon. Startled, Melina wondered what the terrifying scream had been. Kokol asked where it had come from because the echoes made it impossible to tell. Alvin realized the answer first and shouted that it was behind them. The two girls were startled as someone yelled for them to run. They wondered what in the world was happening. A young boy came running toward them while being chased by a large group of mermen. Alvin immediately decided that they had to intercept the monsters. Kokol agreed that they needed to help. Melina noticed that neither of them showed even the slightest hesitation, and she found the sight reassuring. Alvin ordered everyone to change formation. Before they could move, however, Melina asked them to leave the next attack to her. She explained that once the spell was unleashed, they would be greeted by an enormous blast. Alvin pointed out that an adventurer was directly in front of them and asked whether she intended to use an area of effect spell. Melina assured him that it would be fine. The instant she activated the spell, she would signal for everyone to dodge to the left. Alvin understood the plan. He decided to signal the adventurer being chased. Kokol, in turn, decided to cast a buff on Melina and prepared a lightning element enhancement. Melina thanked Alvin and accepted Kokol's support. Alvin took a deep breath before shouting loudly to the fleeing adventurer, instructing them to dodge to the side once he gave the signal. The person, Teto, reacted in confusion before following Alvin's gesture toward one side. Teto noticed a hole there. Looking back, Teto also spotted the two girls behind Alvin and realized they were preparing something. Teto quickly understood that Alvin was directing an evasive maneuver because an area of effect spell was about to be cast. Melina signaled that she was ready. Alvin informed the others that Teto seemed to have understood the plan and told Melina to proceed. She released her spell, and Alvin immediately signaled Teto to dodge. Teto leaped aside just as the spell engulfed the pursuing merman, landing safely inside the hole in time. Teto quietly complained about how rough the girl had been. The mermen were defeated, leaving their drops scattered across the ground. Melina remarked that the escape had gone well. Alvin was impressed. Melina had annihilated a large number of enemies in a single attack, and her observation skills were remarkably sharp. He could hardly believe she had noticed a cavity in a place like that could be used as an escape route. Melina explained that she had developed a habit of paying attention to unexplored terrain in order to find locations suitable for trapping monsters. Alvin turned to Kokol and asked about the accumulated debuff. Kokol replied that their effects had been cleared for the time being. Melina smiled upon hearing the news. Alvin then decided they should finish off the remaining enemies, leaving the method to each of his companions' judgment. Kokol agreed. From inside the hole, Teto watched the three of them rush after the remaining monsters and witnessed them continue fighting. Alvin briefly glanced in Teto's direction. Teto cheerfully referred to Alvin as a big brother and declared an intention to help as well. Alvin told Teto not to overexert themselves and that resting was perfectly fine. A moment later, Alvin was startled when Teto suddenly leaped high enough to disappear from his sight. The girl attacked from above, assuring them that she was fine. She landed lightly on the ground, noting that her HP was still full. She then threw her dagger. Kokol and Melina watched in surprise, while Alvin was left speechless. By the time he realized what had happened, the battle was already over. Later, the group reached the safe point on the 32nd floor. The girl sat down and apologized for carelessly attracting such a massive herd of monsters. Even so, she remarked that they were incredibly strong for having saved her. Alvin told her not to worry. When adventurers found themselves in trouble, they were all in the same boat. The girl introduced herself as Teto and explained that she was a thief. She quickly added that being a thief was only her job class and did not mean she was a criminal outside of dungeons. Alvin replied that the job title shown on her status was merely a classification and that he knew it did not reflect Teto's character. Teto smiled, relieved to hear that. Alvin, Kokol, and Melina then introduced themselves and their respective jobs. Alvin explained that they had met one another inside the setting sun cave and had formed a temporary party. Teto repeated the phrase, temporary party, before Alvin asked whether someone of Teto's ability had really been exploring alone. Teto confirmed that she had. Despite her appearance, she explained that she was actually a high-level adventurer. Melina remarked that Teto certainly talked confidently despite screaming so desperately earlier. Scratching her head, Teto apologized again, admitting that the monster horde had simply been too much for her. Teto went on to explain that a thief exploring a deep layer alone would naturally be searching for treasure chests. Since the setting sun cave had declined in popularity, it had become a little-known location ideal for that kind of work. Alvin fell into thought. Thieves excelled at escaping danger and avoiding unnecessary combat. They specialized in opening treasure chests with their nimble fingers. Because they did not rely on defeating monsters for income, thieves were among the jobs best suited for solo exploration. Considering Teto's combat ability and high level, finding her treasure hunting in the deep layers was not unusual. Even so, Alvin could not shake the feeling that something was bothering him. Before Teto could continue, Alvin suddenly voiced his suspicion that she might also possess a minus skill. Teto asked whether Alvin and his party had come all the way to the setting sun cave because they believed the rumor that the boss drop was an item capable of erasing skills. Alvin, Kokol, and Melina fell silent. Teto questioned whether they were serious before laughing, finding the idea strange. Melina immediately demanded to know what Teto meant. As Melina stood up, Teto raised both hands in response. Teto questioned the very premise of the rumor. Skills a person was born with were meant to remain with them for life. There should be no way to remove them. An item capable of overturning the world's rules simply could not exist. Even so, Alvin and his companions were still intending to pursue it. At the beginning of Chapter 5, Alvin, Kokol, and Melina stood before Teto, questioning him. Kokol remained silent as Teto smiled at them. Melina explained that they had come all the way to that point while investigating the texts found in every nook and cranny because they believed there was definitely something capable of erasing skills. Teto replied that he was only a thief and was not knowledgeable about the specifics of items. He believed that an item capable of tampering with their stats and locking them forever could not possibly exist. Melina argued that Teto had been too quick to fixate on a single perspective. She pointed out that many skills existed in the world that Teto had never heard of, mentioning her god of envy's divine protection and Kokol's usurper of the severed head. Teto fell silent before admitting that it was difficult to prove such a thing did not exist, though he still considered it a fool's errand. Alvin then addressed Teto, acknowledging that such an item might not exist and that he had already considered that possibility before coming there. Even so, they had come all the way. Teto asked whether Alvin had already resolved himself to continue. Alvin confirmed that he had and thanked Teto for the warning, but stated that they were going anyway. Teto then asked what Alvin intended to do after learning that the boss room was on the 40th layer. Alvin was surprised, as it was far deeper than he had expected. The standard for defeating a boss required 4 people with an average level matching the layer plus 10. While they met the level requirement, they did not have enough people. Teto pointed out that no matter how much confidence Alvin had in his skills, they only had 3 members, and he believed defeating the boss would be difficult. Melina observed that Teto was easy to read. When Teto reacted with confusion, Melina concluded that Teto essentially wanted to join their party. Teto blushed and denied it, adding that venturing into such deep layers with only a temporary party was insanely dangerous. Alvin apologized and said that he still did not think it was time to retreat. Teto grimaced. Melina agreed that they first needed to confirm whether the 40th floor even existed. Alvin added that, if possible, they should also confirm the boss's attribute and attack patterns. Kokol understood that this was to prepare perfectly for challenging it later. After remaining silent for a moment, Teto agreed and decided to guide them to the boss room. The party was shocked. Teto explained that he had no interest in fighting the boss, so he had not entered the room, but he had been there before. Alvin said that would save them a great deal of trouble and wondered why Teto was helping them. Teto admitted that they were going to continue no matter what and apologized for getting in their way. Melina was delighted that they could now advance with maximum efficiency and urged Alvin to depart quickly. Before they left, Teto advised them to use poison resistance potions. Alvin questioned the suggestion, and Teto handed them the potions, explaining that they were meant to ward off poison. Alvin remarked that he already knew that much. Kokol noted that if the potions granted poison resistance, she could also buff Teto. Teto explained that most of the monsters beyond that point were poisonous. Kokol accepted the potion and understood. Teto further explained that potions with long-lasting effects were better than buffs that expired quickly, as they would also reduce the burden on the priestess. As Melina accepted one as well, she acknowledged that it was certainly true. As Teto drank a potion, he urged them to hurry and move on. Alvin agreed. Inwardly, he was honestly grateful that they would be able to proceed without taking unnecessary detours. However, the revelation that the boss was on the 40th layer continued to trouble him. He could not recklessly endanger everyone. If he intended to act prudently, he should reconsider their party formation. Before he could do anything, Alvin suddenly found himself unable to move. The potion slipped from his hand and he collapsed to the floor. He immediately realized that he had been deceived. He had been drugged with something, and the status effect was paralysis. Teto laughed, mocking Alvin and the others for being fools who had swallowed something given to them by someone they knew nothing about. Alvin was unable to respond, but he clearly remembered Teto drinking the same potion. Teto then held up her bottle and explained that the one she had consumed was a genuine poison resistance potion. Alvin and the others, on the other hand, had been given an item called the Lime Toad Paralysis Liquid. The 2 liquids had nearly identical colors. After distributing the bottles to everyone, Teto had secretly switched out only his own potion, and Alvin had failed to notice. From where he lay, Alvin saw Melina collapsed on the ground with 2 empty bottles nearby. He wondered whether Kokol had drunk hers as well. At some point, Teto had completely taken control of the conversation. As they became increasingly absorbed by the information she provided, Alvin had eventually neglected to confirm the names of the items, leading to their current predicament. He realized that it was entirely his fault. Teto remarked that Alvin's expression was frightening and blamed his predicament on his tendency to underestimate adventuring professions. She picked up one of Alvin's fingers and stated that she only needed to borrow his hand for a moment before casually opening his storage screen. The items from his inventory spilled onto the floor. Teto declared that she would be taking those belongings before moving on to the sorceress next. At that moment, Kokol suddenly swung her staff from behind Teto in anger, striking the back of Teto's head. Teto immediately leaped backward, drew her dagger, and assumed a fighting stance. She scoffed in surprise, unable to understand how Kokol was standing when she had certainly drunk the potion and the contents of that bottle. Kokol admitted that she had indeed drunk the potion. However, she possessed the paralysis resistance high skill. Teto remarked that it was a useful skill, but questioned why his HP had decreased so much. Kokol explained that it was because she was level 80. Teto was stunned. Kokol confidently stated that her strength was surely greater than Teto's and asked whether Teto truly wanted to fight her in his current state with his remaining HP. Teto wavered before admitting that he had no choice but to surrender. He dropped his dagger, raised his hands, and complained that it was unfair. Kokol remarked that Teto was the last person who should be saying that. Kokol then used healing skills on the others. Melina spat that the entire ordeal had been utter hell and concluded that there was nothing good about Teto. Kokol decided to physically tie Teto up and asked if anyone had a rope. Alvin opened his storage screen, produced one, and Kokol thanked him. She then suggested that they temporarily return and hand Teto over to the guild. Teto complained about the bump on his forehead, prompting Melina to glare at him. She wondered whether they should have handed Teto over to the merman who worked there instead. Alvin was about to react, but Melina revealed that she had only been joking. Even so, she added that Teto could not be let off with a mere joke. Considering the situation, Teto might have intended to carry out a monster PK against them. Monster PK referred to killing an adventurer by luring a large number of monsters toward another target to take that adventurer's life. Teto insisted that it had all been an accident. Kokol replied that she could no longer trust Teto and that he should be left in the guild's custody. Alvin, however, reflected that player adventure killing was a serious taboo. If Teto had truly intended it, then it would have been an extremely malicious act. Whether it had been accidental or deliberate, Melina agreed with Kokol. Bringing Teto along would be difficult, and leaving him behind unattended would be dangerous as well. Holding a memory map, an item that allowed its user to return to a dungeon's entrance from anywhere inside, Kokol asked whether Alvin agreed with returning. Alvin remained silent for a moment before asking if they could postpone it for the time being. Both girls looked confused and asked what was wrong. Alvin explained that there was a strong possibility Teto would escape before they could hand him over to the guild. Teto likely possessed some kind of skill that would allow him to free himself from the bindings. Teto chuckled, implying that Alvin was overthinking the situation. Alvin continued, reasoning that Teto's carefree attitude stemmed from his confidence that he could escape whenever he wished. Teto fell silent. Alvin admitted that he lacked formal education, but whenever he sensed that something might be suspicious, he always tried to think through the reason behind it. That habit had been taught to him by his sword master, so he had done the same this time. He then asked Teto why he had stolen only the essential supplies needed for long expeditions. Teto insinuated that Alvin was imagining things. Alvin pointed out that Teto had taken only their potions, food, and spare equipment. He then opened his palm to reveal something that Teto had left untouched. Melina immediately recognized it. It was the merman's tear. Alvin pointed out that if Teto's goal had truly been to rob them, he would never have ignored such a rare item, especially after claiming to be familiar with it. Teto offered no response. Kokol concluded that this meant Teto had not been trying to rob them or carry out a monster PK, but had instead been attempting to stop them from progressing any farther. Teto groaned in frustration and exclaimed that if they had already figured out that much, they should simply listen and go home. Kokol asked what Teto meant. Melina wondered whether there was some secret beyond that point. Teto explained that they had saved his life, so he believed it was his responsibility to stop them in return. However, if they insisted on continuing, they should simply challenge the boss and die. The party fell silent. Kokol asked whether Teto knew something about the boss. Teto reminded her that she did not trust anything he said. Alvin acknowledged that Teto's actions and words had been suspicious, but they could also be interpreted as the actions of someone genuinely trying to stop them from recklessly challenging the boss. He urged Teto to answer them, adding that depending on what they learned, they might temporarily withdraw as Teto had suggested. Teto looked at Alvin for a moment before revealing that there was a secret surrounding the boss, and that was the reason no one had ever defeated it. He asked the girls whether they possessed a map of the levels beneath the deep layers of the Setting Sun Cave. One of them replied that they did not, explaining that even map merchants had been unable to obtain one. Teto said that was only natural and questioned whether they did not find that strange. Normally, parties that made progress during dungeon raids sold partial maps for extra money. Melina suggested that the lack of maps might simply be because the Setting Sun Cave had only appeared recently or because it was unpopular. Teto denied that explanation. The real reason was that not a single party that had ventured into the cave had ever returned. Alvin immediately rejected the claim, insisting that every adventurer capable of reaching the 40th floor would have acted cautiously. Teto scoffed at the mention of caution. Melina questioned his reaction, prompting Teto to ask them to hear him out. Teto explained that, as he had mentioned earlier, poisonous monsters awaited them beyond that point. However, as long as a party could deal with the poison, they would reach the boss room quickly, without much difficulty. Having conserved most of their resources, those cautious adventurers would naturally think about taking a quick look inside the boss room. The three of them silently recalled their own earlier intentions. Melina had wanted to confirm whether the 40th floor even existed. Alvin had hoped to observe the boss's attributes and attack patterns if possible, and Kokol had agreed that doing so would allow them to challenge it with perfect preparation later. Teto continued by explaining that the moment those adventurers entered the boss room became their final moment. The door closed automatically after entry, and no adventurer had ever returned. At the same time, the dungeon remained intact, proving that the boss had never been defeated. The party was left speechless. Alvin concluded that the reason no party had ever returned was simple: every one of them had been annihilated by the boss. The automatically closing door made it clear that retreat was impossible, leaving only two possible outcomes: victory or death. At the beginning of Chapter 6, Teto confirmed that retreat was not permitted inside the boss room. That was why every adventurer was forced to defeat the boss during their very first encounter. Kokol considered this for a moment before recalling that she had fought quite a few bosses in deep layers. Alvin remarked that this was only natural since Kokol was an exceptionally high-level healer. He asked whether there was something she could not make sense of. Kokol explained that it was normal for boss rooms to forbid retreat because each one contained its own gimmick. Teto remarked that this was done to prevent anyone from bringing back information about those mechanisms. Kokol agreed, adding that whenever such special conditions existed, the dungeon always contained clues about them, whether through similar gimmicks or its lore. She did not know why, but that was simply how dungeons worked. Therefore, since this dungeon lacked anything resembling such clues, she could not imagine its boss room containing a gimmick that prevented retreat. Melina wondered whether Teto was lying again. Alvin remained silent. Teto protested that if the dungeon were not especially large and levels and manpower alone were enough, it would have been conquered already. Alvin asked whether Teto was suggesting that some hidden secret was involved. Teto replied that he was certain there was, describing it as an extremely perplexing gimmick unique to that boss. Even so, he found it irrational that there were no hints leading to it. Kokol agreed, saying that dungeons should not be irrational, even if exceptions sometimes existed. Melina fell into thought before apologizing for interrupting. The other three turned toward her. She observed that Teto seemed remarkably knowledgeable about the Setting Sun Cave and questioned why he had come there in the first place. Teto was unable to answer. Kokol and Alvin looked at him. Kokol guessed that he had come seeking the treasure chests located in the deeper layers. Melina disagreed, pointing out that there were no maps of the deeper levels and no survivors who had returned from them. Teto could not have known that those deeper levels even existed when he first entered the cave. Kokol understood. Melina then added another point. Until Teto had concluded that the boss room forbade retreat and was nearly impossible to conquer, he would have had to observe numerous parties entering the boss room. Alvin considered her reasoning. Kokol concluded that Teto could not have been challenging the boss alongside those parties, as the idea itself sounded strange. Melina then asked what motive Teto had for waiting outside the boss room. Caught off guard, Teto admitted that Melina had already figured it out. Kokol glanced at Melina as she let out a quiet breath. Teto told them to ask Alvin instead. Alvin replied that it was only his prediction and invited Teto to correct him if he was mistaken. Teto recalled his childhood. As a child, he had constantly struggled with others over scarce resources. During that life, he had once overheard a story about a group of adventurers who did not fight over resources but instead faced challenges together as equals. At the age of 10, he became an adventurer in pursuit of that ideal. However, he knew that if he continued thinking of himself as someone lowly, he would never gain companions. He wanted to challenge the world alongside others as an equal. While facing a group of undead with his party, his companions prepared for battle. To his shock, all of his stats suddenly dropped, leaving him barely able to move. He asked his party to cast a spell to remove the abnormal effect from him. As the undead closed in and he collapsed to the ground, his companions fled despite his desperate pleas for them to save him. He wept, but managed to roll into a crack in the wall, allowing the undead to pass him by. Hidden inside, he covered his mouth as he cried, realizing how naive he had been. From that moment onward, he swore that he would never form another party again. As time passed, Teto eventually came to the caves. He resolved to find his own way somehow. Even boss drops no longer tempted him as a thief of low status. All he needed to do was steal a party's drops after they defeated a boss. Back in the present, Melina fumed upon learning that Teto had been stealing boss drop. Alvin explained that Teto had not challenged the boss alongside the other parties because he had been waiting for an opportunity to steal the boss drops after they defeated it. Teto admitted that a solo thief had no realistic way of obtaining boss drops otherwise. Kokol pointed out that Teto had effectively confessed and concluded that he should be handed over to the guild after all. Alvin remarked that, judging from Teto's lack of preparation, stealing loot did not seem to be his usual practice. This occasion had been different because Teto had no other choice. Alvin concluded that the reason for that was because Teto also possessed a minus skill. Teto replied that there had been no opportunity to steal anything anyway since the boss room did not permit retreat. He then asked how Alvin had figured it out. Alvin explained that while they had been fighting the mermen, he had noticed Teto using many different kinds of skills. The girls had not paid attention to the specific skills, but Alvin had because he was also a fighter. Based on what he had observed and their current situation, Alvin had formed the assumption that possessing an unusually large number of skills was evidence of being a minus skill bearer. Once he accepted that assumption, many things about Teto began to make sense. Kokol observed that even though Teto knew stealing was practically impossible, he still had not given up and had remained there. Teto replied that he was not as stubborn as she believed. Exploring the treasure chests in the deep layers had been enjoyable enough on its own. Alvin then asked whether Teto had witnessed many capable adventurers fail to conquer the boss room during that time. Teto fell silent before admitting that he had warned them about the danger, but no one had listened. He complained that adventurers were as dense as rock. Melina quietly accepted his words. Teto added that temporary parties full of young adventurers like them kept appearing, so he felt compelled to at least warn them. He then remarked that if he had managed to find companions willing to accompany him that far, perhaps that alone should have been enough, even if he could never rid himself of his minus skill. Alvin's eyes widened. Kokol asked Alvin what Teto's minus skill actually did. Alvin admitted that he did not know. Teto quietly revealed its name, mummy theft. Kokol failed to hear him and asked again. Teto repeated that it was mummy theft, calling it an incredibly troublesome skill. Kokol admitted it was her first time hearing of it, while Melina said she could not imagine its effect at all. Alvin asked Teto to explain. Teto sighed before revealing that the skill transferred every debuff received by his party members onto himself. The three immediately focused on that explanation. Alvin quickly realized the general nature of the skill but worried that it merely concentrated every debuff onto Teto. Melina questioned whether it truly affected only debuff. Kokol asked whether Teto could actually distinguish between effects that counted as debuffs and those that did not. Alvin questioned why that was the first thing the two of them focused on, admitting that he never understood how magic users thought. Kokol explained that although adventurers commonly separated buffs and debuffs, both were technically treated as status effects. Melina added that when someone cast the clear spell, both buffs and debuffs were removed simultaneously. Therefore, if someone could distinguish between them before applying such effects, it would be significant. Before she could finish, Kokol interrupted to remark that such an ability was extraordinarily rare. Alvin reluctantly agreed. Teto remarked that no matter how rare it was, the skill remained nothing but a burden to him. Kokol questioned whether it was not actually an advantage instead. Teto explained that if every party member received a debuff such as endurance reduction low, all of those debuffs would ultimately be transferred onto him. Normally, receiving the same debuff multiple times would not strengthen its effect, but mummy theft did not work that way. If he received the same low-ranked debuff 4 times, it would be upgraded to special rank. The rank of every transferred effect increased according to the number of times he received it. When multiple kinds of debuffs accumulated simultaneously, the result became utterly disastrous. To him, it was nothing short of hell. He recalled that during the incident with his former party, all of his stats had been reduced by half. Those companions had abandoned him to die while he was on the verge of death. Ever since then, he had specialized in adventuring alone. Alvin commented that such an experience must have been catastrophic. At that moment, Melina suddenly noticed something unusual. She questioned how all of Teto's stats could have been reduced by at least half. Teto remarked that Melina truly did not trust him. She denied it, explaining that she simply wanted to understand everything clearly. Teto blushed. Melina quietly reasoned through the skill's mechanics. Since mummy theft caused debuffs to rank up instead of multiplying, if Teto absorbed 4 medium-rank debuffs, they would simply rise to the maximum rank of special. Because the debuff effect was overridden by the higher rank rather than stacked, his stats should not have fallen below half. Teto confirmed that her understanding was correct. However, he added that certain combinations of debuffs caused their effects to multiply instead. He explained that combining total stat reduction with endurance reduction was enough to cut both his vitality and endurance in half. Melina pointed out that even then, having all of his stats reduced by half would have required an extraordinarily severe situation. Teto admitted that such a circumstance normally would not occur. However, it became possible when the secondary effect of mummy theft activated. Melina realized that this was where the true nature of the skill came into play. Teto explained that his minus skill caused its effects to fluctuate under a certain condition. Its description stated that whenever party members received effects that negatively affected their stats, the bearer of mummy theft received those effects instead, and that the effects transferred by the skill fluctuated depending on the party's overall reward acquisition rate. Melina asked about that condition, and Kokol questioned whether that was the trigger. Teto replied that it was likely tied to some hidden statistic. Since it never appeared on his status screen, he had no way to verify it other than through experience. He had observed that if party members possessed reward-enhancing skills such as prosperity, fortune, or increased drop rate, the transferred debuffs became stronger. He believed this corresponded to a high reward acquisition rate. Every time he received a debuff, its effect increased, and the amount of that increase depended on both the number and quality of those reward-related skills. As a result, the severity of the debuffs inflicted upon him could suddenly escalate. Alvin suddenly asked whether those effects could also decrease. Teto paused before replying that, since the skill description specifically mentioned fluctuation, perhaps the opposite was also possible through skills such as God of Poverty's divine protection, misfortune, or reduced drop rate. Before he could continue, Melina abruptly stepped closer and asked how much the effects could decrease. Teto admitted that he had no idea. Melina complained that he should know more about his own skill. Teto dismissed the matter, saying they were no longer forming a party anyway, so it was irrelevant. Besides, he would never willingly join such an unfortunate party. The word unfortunate struck Alvin deeply enough that he collapsed to the ground. Kokol immediately urged him to pull himself together. Melina insisted that even a rough estimate would be enough. Teto, confused by her sudden enthusiasm, explained that if the exact opposite of his previous party's reward-enhancing skills were present, such as reduced drop rate, medium-ranked misfortune, and similar effects, a low-ranked debuff might even be completely nullified. Both girls' eyes widened. Melina eagerly suggested testing the theory first and happily invited Teto to join their party. Teto questioned whether she had been listening at all and repeated that he would never join another party. Melina replied that he only needed to accompany them for 2 or 3 battles, insisting that he had nothing to lose. Teto still hesitated. At that moment, Alvin proposed another idea. He tossed something toward Teto and told him to catch it. Teto was stunned to see that it was the merman's tear. Instinctively, he slipped free of the ropes and caught it in midair. The others were astonished. Melina remarked that Teto had escaped the bindings as effortlessly as breathing. Alvin then asked whether that meant Teto would be accompanying them after all. Teto accepted the offer without hesitation. At the beginning of Chapter 7, the group had reached the 32nd floor. Kokol apologized to Teto for hitting him from behind. Teto told her there was no need to apologize because he had gone that far of his own accord, and she had restored his HP afterward. Kokol explained that she had not been referring to his HP. She believed she had missed the spot that would have hurt him the most. Teto looked at her and asked if she meant injuries. He said he could handle that sort of thing, as he sometimes took hits to the chin during fights that made it crack loudly. Kokol was surprised. In this world, any damage not caused by dungeon installations, such as monster gimmicks, could sometimes leave wounds that could not be healed by magic. Teto then remarked that even without modifying Kokol's stats, she possessed ridiculous strength. He thought he would have to be careful not to make her angry. Kokol tearfully questioned what he meant by calling her ridiculous. Watching them, Melina asked Alvin if he was not being a little too generous. Alvin replied that they would not make any progress until Teto and Kokol joined them. Melina quietly wondered whether it might be a coping mechanism for Teto's habit of calling them poor. Alvin did not answer. Instead, he asked why they were in the setting cave again. Melina explained that they wanted to remove their minus skills. Alvin asked what they planned to do afterward. Melina said that once they succeeded, she wanted to officially form a party. She aspired to take on adventures and hidden places that could not be tackled alone. Alvin smiled, agreeing that a proper party would be a good idea. He then wondered whether Teto wanted the same, as Teto had given off a fairly reluctant impression. Alvin recalled Teto saying that if he managed to gain comrades willing to accompany him at this point, that alone would be enough even if he could not get rid of his minus skill. Because of that, Alvin wondered whether this might become a good opportunity for Teto. Teto asked whether they were heading to the lower floors. Alvin approached him and explained that they were searching around the current floor for monsters capable of inflicting debuff. Teto asked if that was because they wanted to test the effects of mummy theft and see whether its buffs would accumulate on him. He agreed to go along with it. Considering that he had received such an amazing gem, he intended to guide them all the way to the boss room. As Teto ran forward, he stepped onto a patch of ice and fell to the ground. Wincing in pain, he wondered why that particular spot had been frozen. Melina questioned what he was doing. Teto's eyes widened as he warned everyone. Standing before him was a frost chimera. Alvin immediately recognized it as a powerful monster and was astonished that it had appeared on this floor, concluding that it must have been lying in hiding. The girls asked Alvin what they should do and whether they should retreat. The moment Teto heard the word retreat, he froze. Fear gripped him as he imagined being left behind once again. Just like before, everyone would run away while using him as a decoy. He desperately rejected that thought. The possibility that something so miserable could happen, even after believing they had become his comrades, horrified him. All he had ever wanted were comrades. As those thoughts consumed him and he became convinced he was going to die, Kokol's voice suddenly reached him, asking whether he could hear her. Teto was startled. Kokol pulled him to his feet, relieved because she had been worried when he failed to get back up and had thought he was seriously hurt. When Teto looked back, he saw Alvin fighting the chimera. Kokol thanked Alvin before turning back to Teto. Teto then asked whether they were not going to run away. Alvin explained that if he had been alone, he might have been forced to waste an item to retreat, but with their combined strength, they could handle it. As long as Teto had no objections, they would continue fighting. Teto repeated those words in shock. None of the girls had stopped chanting. None of them were running away. None of them were abandoning him. Filled with determination, Teto realized that he could do this. Alvin smiled at him in affirmation. At that moment, the chimera leaped backward and let out a roar. Alvin recognized the movement immediately. A roar after jumping backward meant it was about to unleash a freezing breath that would reach all the way to their rear guard. Teto asked whether the chimera's breath was its strongest attack. Alvin confirmed that it was and explained that they had to avoid confronting it head-on. Alvin was confused when Teto stepped in front of him, but he soon realized what Teto was trying to do. Teto explained that if the situation became dangerous, he would try to protect Alvin. Kokol granted Teto a small amount of freeze resistance, warning him that it was only a slight increase and that he should still be careful. Teto thanked her. Teto fixed his gaze on the chimera. Behind its heads, he suddenly noticed a snake. Immediately spotting the opening, he threw his dagger. The blade flew past the heads and struck the snake. The group noticed that the chimera's breathing motion stopped. Alvin saw the monster recoil and recognized it as a counterattack. He wondered whether anyone could have aimed for something like that. Teto called for Melina's lightning. Smiling, she raised her staff, and an explosion erupted. Teto quietly marveled at the incredible firepower. However, he soon noticed the chimera's wings and was shocked to see that it was still standing. Alvin realized it was about to take flight, and if it escaped upward, dealing with it would become much more difficult. Feeling apologetic, he decided he would have to go for the killing blow. Before he could begin chanting, however, Teto suddenly dashed forward. Alvin could only admire his incredible agility. Alvin watched as Teto confidently unleashed his attack, slashing the beast from top to bottom and defeating it. Alvin and the girls were left speechless. Blushing slightly, Alvin muttered that the knife was cool and kind of shiny. Kokol found herself wondering if that was really what Alvin had been focused on. Melina remarked that Teto not only possessed many techniques but was also surprisingly capable at mid-range combat. Smoke drifted through the smoky surroundings as Teto stood there panting. He looked at the others with joy. Alvin thought that Teto looked like a true badass. Teto turned toward him. In Teto's mind, adventurers like these had always been fools. He had always looked down on parties that parted ways in such a manner. Even now, after finally finding comrades willing to fight beside him, he questioned why they were risking their lives based on such certain information. Then he realized that way of thinking was wrong. There had surely been people with minus skills in those parties as well, and their comrades had accepted them. Like the adventurers from those stories, they shared both hardships and joys while overcoming challenges together. Teto had always envied that. His party waved to him. Teto wondered whether it was truly all right for him to go to them. Then he smiled, walked over, and high-fived Alvin while apologizing for taking his kill. Teto was deeply moved. Later, Alvin checked his status before commenting that he had no idea the snake tail was the chimera's weak point. Teto blushed and replied that it had simply seemed that way. Surprised, Alvin asked whether Teto had not actually known. Teto admitted that it had been his first time fighting a chimera species. Alvin wondered whether that was how Teto's skill worked. Teto denied it and instead asked whether it was not something people could intuitively understand. He remarked that Alvin seemed to have a great deal of combat experience. Alvin answered that it was not. Melina joined them, finding the topic intriguing. She wanted a more detailed explanation, hoping she might become able to identify weak points herself. Teto admitted that it was difficult to put into words. After thinking for a moment, he explained that he believed people could figure such things out by putting themselves in the creator's shoes. Alvin and Melina questioned that idea. Teto reminded them that they had heard this world was supposedly a simulation or a miniature garden. If that were true, then he believed a creator existed. If there were no invincible monsters, then there could be no unstoppable weapons either. As adventurers ventured deeper into a dungeon, the monsters grew stronger, and when a boss was defeated, it disappeared. Alvin remarked that, although no one knew why, that was simply how the world worked. Teto nodded and concluded that this meant the world was balanced. Because of that, he believed monster weak points would never be placed somewhere nobody could reasonably discover, but instead would appear in places and at moments where they could be noticed. More often than not, a monster's weak point became apparent either before or after it performed a major attack. Melina considered his explanation. Teto added that it was a special skill he had developed through countless battles. He admitted with a chuckle that he honestly could not get rid of the habit anymore. Alvin remarked that, rather than being a special skill, it sounded more like wild intuition. Teto questioned that assessment. Melina said that even if Teto's miniature garden hypothesis was correct, she sadly believed it would be impossible for her to identify weak points. She did not think she would get along with the supposed creator. She explained that if she were hiding treasure, she would place it somewhere nobody would ever find it. Teto replied that this was exactly why he had said the concept was difficult to explain. At that moment, The others sensed an unusual aura from Kokol and asked what she thought about it. Looking at her, Melina suddenly remembered something and asked what had happened to her god of envy's curse. Kokol checked herself and found that it was completely gone. Melina remarked that the result matched what they had expected. Alvin could hardly believe it. Melina wondered whether it had been a coincidence or an inevitability. Alvin said he did not care which it was because he was simply happy. Kokol quietly reflected that miracles truly did exist. From behind them, Teto asked what they were all whispering about. He reminded them that if they wanted to witness the effects of mummy theft, he would first have to suffer a debuff. For the moment, however, they should continue onward. The three of them immediately turned toward him with mischievous grins. Melina thought it would also be interesting to see how Teto behaved under an ordinary debuff. Alvin agreed that it certainly sounded intriguing. Kokol remarked that things were becoming quite exciting. Teto became flustered. As the three of them hummed and walked on ahead, he wondered whether it would really be safe to let his guard down around them. At the beginning of Chapter 8, Alvin remarked that they still had not managed to find anything that would attack them with debuff. Kokol commented that it was one of those situations where the very thing they were searching for refused to appear. Teto suggested that they look at something else instead. He held up his knife and asked what they thought of it and whether they considered it cool. He explained that as the blade's speed increased, it left behind a trail of light, and that was the whole point of it. Alvin admitted that it was pretty cool. Melina asked whether the trail itself had any effect. Teto replied that it did not and that it only looked cool. Melina remarked that the reasoning sounded rather lame, but Teto and Alvin immediately insisted that it was not lame but romantic. Alvin added that it was something only two men could understand. Teto agreed, saying the weapon's attack power was already amazing on its own. Although his physical strength could never match that of the priestess, he believed he would not lose when it came to sheer firepower. Kokol giggled, thinking that Teto was certainly enjoying himself. Melina observed that it was a very rare weapon and asked whether it was a boss drop that Teto had stolen from someone. Teto indignantly denied it and explained that he had found the knife himself on the 50th floor of the ancient dragon temple. Hearing that it came from the 50th floor, Alvin paused to think. Melina then asked Teto what level he was. Teto answered that he was level 55 and possessed 9 skills. Melina was shocked to learn that Teto's level exceeded theirs. She apologized for doubting him earlier, realizing there had been no helping it. Teto replied that he looked like an ordinary brat, and by the time he realized it, he had reached that level because he had been so focused on treasure hunting. Just then, Alvin heard a sound and recognized it as an aqua salamander. He explained that if they provoked it slightly, it would attack them with the debuff agility reduction, small. However, if its HP dropped too low, it might not use the debuff at all. Since adjusting its HP precisely was difficult for him, Alvin asked whether he could count on Teto. Teto welcomed the opportunity and said he would simply pelt it with throwing knives. After Teto struck the aqua salamander, it responded by casting its debuff. Alvin confirmed that everything was fine and that he would take it. He absorbed the debuff before slashing the aqua salamander down. Its drops scattered across the floor. Teto hurried over and asked Alvin to show him his status. Alvin pointed out that Teto could not see any debuff icon on his status, but when Teto checked his own status, he became confused because he had not received the debuff either. Teto assumed Alvin must have gotten it instead, but Alvin said that he had not. Thinking back, Teto realized that the previous debuff had not affected him either. Unable to understand what was happening, he questioned why he was receiving so many experience points despite not delivering the finishing blow. He also wondered why his status points were increasing so dramatically. He asked whether this was the result of someone's skill and what it all meant. The three of them smiled at him. Melina stepped forward and explained that Kokol had not been affected by the god of envy's curse either. With that, everything had become clear. Melina then asked Teto for the second time to join their party. Confused, Teto replied that he had already joined their party earlier. Melina realized her mistake. Teto asked whether she was all right and wondered if she had been afflicted with an abnormal status that interfered with her memory. Melina denied that and clarified that it was not what she had meant. Without thinking, she blurted out that she wanted Teto to remain by her side forever from that point onward. Teto became flustered at hearing such words so suddenly. Melina immediately grew embarrassed. Kokol thought that Melina had done it this time. Melina admitted that the exchange had gone far enough and clarified that she meant Teto should join them not merely as a guide, but as a proper member of the party. Relieved, Teto said that before discussing that matter, he wanted an explanation for the strange numerical values affecting his status and experience point gain. Melina agreed that it was only fair and decided to explain everything from the beginning. She revealed that every one of them possessed a minus skill. Teto was shocked to learn that it was all of them. Until then, he had assumed that Kokol alone had come in search of the rumored boss drop. Melina explained that each of them had arrived there independently. Just as Alvin had told Teto before, they had formed only a temporary party after meeting one another in the dungeon. Teto quietly muttered something to himself before dismissing it as nothing. He then pointed out that gathering so many people with minus skills into a single party seemed like it could become a serious problem in the future. Melina considered his concern before suggesting that Kokol explain her skill first. Kokol agreed. She explained that her minus skill was called Usurper of the Severed Head. Its effect caused the possessor of the skill to be treated as the one who killed a monster whenever a party member defeated it. Furthermore, any skills that activated after a kill would fail to resolve. Teto remarked that it was an unusual skill, meaning Kokol would end up monopolizing all the skill-related bonuses. That also explained why her level was so extraordinarily high. As he thought it over, Teto could not help feeling that Kokol had truly been cursed by fate. Kokol confirmed that this was indeed the case. Teto asked why the two of them had decided to team up with Kokol. Melina explained that her skill was essential to Kokol. Her minus skill was called God of Envy's Divine Protection. It increased the stats of the entire party by 10%. In addition, whenever a party member killed a monster, the killer's stats were reduced by 3%, while the killer's experience bonuses were evenly distributed among the other party members instead. Teto commented that it was a complicated skill, but he now understood where the increase in his status values had come from. Kokol explained that, thanks to Melina's skill, she was prevented from taking all of the kill bonuses for herself. Melina added that, even so, the remaining problem was the debuff that accumulated on Kokol. Curious about that, Teto asked where the debuff came from, wondering if they were referring to the 3% reduction to all stats. Melina confirmed that they were. The effect, known as God of Envy's Curse, inflicted that stat-reducing debuff on the one treated as the killer. Teto remarked that he would not want to have his stats constantly reduced like that. Melina agreed, saying anyone normally would. After thinking it over, Teto said he finally understood. Since Kokol was level 80, she could withstand the repeated stat reductions to a certain extent because her base stats were already so high. Kokol added that the greater benefit was preventing herself from monopolizing all the kill bonuses, and she could simply remove the debuff by using a cleansing skill. Alvin thought to himself that Teto grasped things remarkably quickly. Even after receiving a detailed explanation, Alvin himself had only barely understood the mechanic. Teto then pointed out that he did not see any debuff on Kokol at the moment and asked whether she had already used her cleansing skill. Kokol replied that she had not. Teto grew even more confused. According to the effects they had described, the debuff from God of Envy's Curse should have been transferred to him instead. Yet both that debuff and the one from the Aqua Salamander had completely vanished. He wondered whether Mummy's theft had somehow affected them. Melina denied that assumption. In fact, she explained, it was precisely because Mummy's theft had taken effect that the debuffs had disappeared. She reminded him that Mummy's theft possessed an additional effect, one that caused debuff strength to fluctuate according to the party's reward acquisition rate. Melina then asked Alvin to explain his own skill. Alvin agreed. As he began describing his minus skill, Teto listened intently. Alvin revealed that his minus skill was simply drop rate reduction special. Teto could hardly believe it and instinctively remarked that Alvin was pitiful. The word struck Alvin for the second time, causing his confidence to wither once again. Teto quickly apologized. Smiling, Teto observed that it was thanks to this skill that their reward acquisition rate had become so terribly low that it was enough to erase even his debuff. Alvin replied that he did not know the exact formulas governing Mummy's theft, but he could say that his skill was capable of completely negating debuffs such as the low-grade or effects that reduced a single stat by 5%, as well as God of Envy's Curse, which reduced all stats by 3%. Teto still felt that something did not add up. Drop rate reduction special reduced their reward acquisition rate by 80%, yet they had been obtaining monster drops normally all this time. As he pondered the contradiction, he pointed toward the drops on the floor. Kokol asked whether he had forgotten the additional effect of Usurper of the Severed Head, namely that skills which activated after a kill would fail to activate. Teto immediately recalled that effect. He then pointed at the three of them as he pieced everything together. Through the combination of Kokol's Usurper of the Severed Head and Alvin's drop rate reduction special, the latter's effect never activated. Alvin recalled that he and Kokol had first met immediately after entering the Setting Sun Cave. At that time, he had sincerely asked Kokol to form a party with him. To Alvin, it now felt as though all of that had happened a very long time ago. Melina noticed Kokol blushing intensely and asked what was wrong. Kokol replied that she had simply been thinking about how everything had come full circle. Melina accepted Kokol's explanation. She concluded that, if they took into account how each of their minus skills cancelled out the other's drawbacks, then adding Teto completed the entire loop. She further explained that the skills did more than simply negate one another. They also granted a constant 10% increase to all stats while nullifying low-ranked debuff. If anything, the combination placed them at an advantage. Deep down, Alvin admitted to himself that he still had not completely sorted it all out. Much of their understanding came from conjectures based on the results they had observed so far, so he decided it would be easier to think through exactly what had happened during the battle they had just fought. When the Aqua Salamander cast Agility Reduction low, Alvin received the debuff. In that battle, Alvin also dealt the finishing blow. Under God of Envy's divine protection, every party member constantly received a 10% increase to all stat. As combat began, the Aqua Salamander's Agility Reduction low struck Alvin. Through Mummy's theft, the Agility Reduction was transferred to Teto. Then, because of Alvin's drop rate reduction special, the transferred Agility Reduction was completely negated. Afterward, Alvin attacked, and the Aqua Salamander was defeated. Through Usurper of the Severed Head, Kokol was treated as the one who had slain the monster. As the designated killer, Kokol became the target of God of Envy's curse from Melina's skill. Through Mummy's theft, that curse was transferred to Teto. Then, due to drop rate reduction special, God of Envy's curse was also completely negated. The battle then proceeded to process the kill bonuses, which amounted to 3 times the normal experience. Through Usurper of the Severed Head, all kill bonuses were assigned to Kokol. Then, under God of Envy's divine protection, those bonuses were confiscated from Kokol and distributed evenly among the other 3 party members. Finally, the battle processed the normal item drop. Drop rate reduction special drastically lowered the drop rate, but Usurper of the Severed Head prevented effects that activated after a kill from resolving, rendering the drop rate reduction completely null and void. It was synergy. Kokol explained that this was how highly compatible skills could amplify one another's effect. Such interactions could be described as synergy. Alvin remarked that the quartet of skills had come together in a way that perfectly meshed with one another. Melina added that it was astonishing for such synergistic effects to arise from nothing but minus skills. Alvin asked whether the explanation had been sufficient for Teto. Melina added that, considering their unusually large number of skills for their respective levels, their generally high level of proficiency, and the balance of their party composition, there were very few parties that could satisfy all those conditions as they did. Kokol assured Teto that if he was worried about how much of a debuff might remain after the interactions, he did not need to be concerned. If any residual debuff effect survived, she would certainly remove it with her endowment effect clearing spell. Teto then asked whether joining the party meant accompanying them even in the boss fight. Melina glanced at Kokol. Alvin confirmed that it did. He admitted that Teto might see it as a difficult decision and that he could be forced to make hard choices in the future. There was also no guarantee that they would even obtain the item capable of removing their skills after defeating the boss. Teto fell silent. Alvin continued by saying that, despite all of that, they had already assembled a party capable of coming extremely close to defeating the boss. Since they had reached that point, they intended to challenge it. Alvin wanted to face the boss together with Teto and overcome it alongside him. At the beginning of Chapter 9, the party fought another monster on the 40th floor. The monster used magic. Alvin dashed forward, knowing that Kokol's powerful elemental enhancement was already taking effect. All he needed to do was focus on landing his attack. Swinging his sword with force, he struck the monster. Melina noticed something and warned that its next ranged attack would probably be different. Alvin was surprised that it had already lost 10% of its HP so quickly. He recognized that the ranged attack should come as 3 consecutive blasts. He immediately leaped aside so the attack would not reach the rear line. As he passed the girls, he noticed Melina and wondered if she had begun chanting after realizing how long the 3 consecutive attacks would take. Teto observed that Melina seemed to have something in mind. Alvin replied that she was probably planning to finish the monster with the next attack, though they would need tremendous firepower to accomplish that. Teto asked what they should do. Alvin reasoned that they would not know whether the ranged attack had truly changed until the first blast was fired. He instructed Teto to keep an eye on Melina while he intercepted the ranged attack. Teto acknowledged the plan and told Alvin not to let him down. Alvin judged that the rear guard was outside the attack's range. The vanguard would draw the monster's attention, buying time while dealing damage. They barely needed to exchange words to understand one another. Their party was remarkably easy to fight alongside. The monster suddenly attacked, but Kokol cast darkness resistance, large. Alvin praised her impeccable timing. He met the first attack with his parry skill. He then blocked the second attack as well. Everything unfolded exactly as they had expected. He attempted to parry the third attack too, but fully parrying a monster on the deepest floors proved too difficult. Alvin was knocked to the ground, but Kokol immediately healed him. He praised her for always healing him at the right moment and thanked her. Teto then called out a warning as he dashed forward. He remarked that the monster would become extremely stiff after just a little more. He slashed across it repeatedly, declaring that he had plenty more attacks to follow, before striking it again. Teto landed lightly on the ground with a grin. Alvin watched as part of the monster was torn apart and wondered whether Teto was using a dagger technique whose power increased with every consecutive hit. Melina raised her staff and aimed it forward. After thanking the 2 frontliners for buying her enough time, she unleashed an overwhelming burst of firepower. Alvin was amazed. The sight reminded Alvin of his previous party. He recalled shouting at Sharon not to remain standing where the monster bat's ranged attack would reach him. Alvin had been shocked to realize that Sharon intended to continue casting even if it meant taking the hit. The bat flew toward Sharon, who simply looked up while raising his staff. Afterward, Alvin remembered hearing the laughter of his former comrades as they talked excitedly about a rare item. Back then, Alvin had told Sharon that he should not have stood so close under those circumstances. Sharon had become irritated, insisting that moving while casting risked ruining the spell and that a great swordsman should know as much. Alvin had replied that the real issue was standing where the attack could hit him. Sharon had questioned whether Alvin was only saying that because Alvin wanted to secure the kill before Sharon finished chanting. He had sarcastically asked whether Alvin was really trying to claim it was dangerous. Alvin had answered that it truly was dangerous, but before he could continue, Sharon had thrust a spherical item in front of his face. Sharon proudly declared that the rare item had dropped because he had taken the risk and landed the killing blow, then angrily demanded to know whether Alvin, with his drop rate reduction, understood that. Alvin could not respond. In the end, he admitted that Sharon had been right. Alvin thought that, once things settled down, he could safely hand over the party leader's responsibilities. He intended to suggest moving to a shallower floor. As the party leader, it was impossible not to worry about income, expenses, and the problem of overleveling. Perhaps it was time for him to leave. Even so, Alvin had never minded figuring out how to level efficiently despite those restrictions. There had been a certain satisfaction in it. Now, however, he could swing his sword with all his strength without holding back. He wondered if there was anything in the world more enjoyable than that. Back in the present, Alvin praised Melina for a job well done. Massive blasts of light magic like hers were not something he saw very often. Melina replied that if she did not use the spell in actual combat from time to time, she would eventually forget how to cast it. She thanked Alvin for buying enough time for her to complete the incantation. Teto gave Alvin a high five and remarked that Melina's beam had been incredible. Alvin responded that Teto's dagger techniques had been just as impressive. When he turned to Kokol, however, she was fidgeting. Alvin praised her, saying that her healing and support buffs had been the very definition of perfection. Shyly, Kokol returned the high five. Alvin added that they were completely safe whenever HP management was left to her. Blushing, Kokol asked whether he truly thought so. Alvin explained that she had anticipated he would need healing and had begun chanting in advance, all while maintaining her support buff. He added that his own role was much simpler since he only had to think about drawing enmity and dealing damage. Combat roles were easier to understand, so they naturally received most of the attention. Smiling brightly, Alvin declared that healers like Kokol were actually the most essential part of any party. Kokol became so flustered that tears welled up in her eyes. Melina thought Alvin had gone too far and was pushing Kokol's shyness to its limit. In embarrassment, Kokol pulled Melina in front of Alvin and insisted that Melina was even more amazing than she was. Melina protested, telling Kokol not to push all the praise onto her. Kokol explained that Melina had not fumbled a single incantation and had not been hit once during the battle. Since Kokol had stayed close to her the entire time, she knew that for certain. Melina insisted that Kokol should focus on her own role instead. Kokol continued by pointing out that Melina had noticed the change in the monster's ranged attack despite seeing it for the first time. Alvin recalled that moment and agreed. Growing embarrassed herself, Melina modestly said that she had only been observant. She had simply noticed that the pattern of the monster's magic circle had changed. She believed Teto had performed even better. Teto had dealt the most stages of damage, even though she should have contributed more offensive power. She thought it must have been related to the creator theory Teto had mentioned earlier. Teto explained that he had fought abyss demons before. Because of that, he offered to give Melina a special lesson on the proper timing for countering them effectively, treating it as a bonus for joining the party for the first time. Before he could continue, Alvin casually ruffled Teto's hair. Melina remarked that, no matter how they looked at it, it was still strange that Teto could consciously counter such attacks. Alvin agreed, saying it was beyond the level of mere skill. Teto objected, insisting that Alvin was actually far more capable than he was. Alvin asked what exactly he meant. Teto stammered, pointed at Alvin, and failed to find the words. Alvin lightly scolded him, saying there was no need to force himself to come up with something, though he admitted it hurt a little. Teto quickly denied that it was not what he meant. He explained that Alvin was simply good at everything, making it impossible to single out just one quality. Alvin remarked that hearing that somehow hurt even more. Teto then explained that Alvin was exceptionally strong in combat by anyone's standards. He always assessed the entire battlefield and instinctively knew the optimal position to take. Kokol added that, outside of battle, Alvin was excellent at choosing the best routes and knowing the right times to rest. Melina agreed, saying that Alvin was simply outstanding at adventuring. Alvin was deeply moved. It was the first time anyone had ever praised him in that way. Teto remarked that the only problem was that Alvin's minus skill stood out in the worst possible way. Melina told Alvin that he should have a little more confidence in himself. Alvin reflected that planning adventures, managing the party's pace, and constantly paying attention to everyone's condition had all become second nature to him. Those habits had been developed through years of trial and error as an adventurer. Although the countless times he had been expelled from parties had been painful, they had not been meaningless in the end. Later, Teto pointed toward an entrance and identified it as the safe point just before the boss room. Kokol realized that they had reached the final area. Melina noted that they had ultimately failed to find any additional useful text. Alvin checked his status screen and suggested that they eat and take a longer break this time. The four of them sat down at the safe point on the lowest floor. As Teto ate, he complained that field rations were incredibly boring and wished for some roasted meat instead. Melina admitted that she actually liked the rations because they did not contain any dried fruit. Teto asked whether dried fruit was not just squirrel food. Melina was taken aback. Teto added that he would also be satisfied with grilled fish on a stick seasoned with salt. Imagining the meal, Alvin said he wanted to eat fresh vegetables, especially tomatoes like those from his hometown or a steamed potato covered in butter. Kokol hurriedly asked everyone to stop because they were only making her hungrier. Teto remarked that he had always imagined people with holy occupations taking vows of poverty, yet Kokol was nothing like that. Kokol laughed and admitted that the comment hit close to home. Even when she had been in school, she had often been scolded for sneaking candy inside. Curious, Teto asked about it. Kokol explained that she had attended a seminary in a city in the east, although she eventually dropped out. Teto wondered whether she had been expelled for being too much of a glutton. Kokol denied it. Her family's business had declined, leaving them unable to afford her tuition. Melina commented that it was unfortunate. Kokol replied that she did not really see it that way. Even while attending school, she had dreamed of becoming an adventurer, so leaving had given her the opportunity to become independent. Her family's business eventually recovered, and she was even able to send money home. Alvin admired her devotion to her family. Melina then revealed that she had also dropped out of school, although in her case it had been a magic academy. Kokol expressed her surprise, saying it sounded wonderful since she herself had abandoned the idea of pursuing higher education because it had been too expensive. Melina apologized and explained that her family belonged to the lower ranks of the nobility. Alvin jokingly remarked that she was a real lady. Melina explained that, as the fourth daughter, she had never expected to receive a marriage proposal. Her parents had therefore encouraged her to attend the academy in hopes of finding a suitable husband. Teto burst into laughter, wondering if she had essentially been searching for a man. He found the idea completely out of character for Melina. At the mention of marriage, Kokol blushed. Melina reproached Teto for being rude before continuing that, given her minus skill, she had ultimately become an adventurer in order to leave home. Teto admitted that, having grown up in an orphanage, he could not truly imagine the hardships they had experienced. He had become an adventurer simply because he wanted money. Even so, he remained grateful to the orphanage and still sent food and money there from time to time. Alvin was so moved that he nearly cried over Teto's kindness. Noticing Alvin looking at him, Teto asked what was wrong. Alvin smiled and said that, if Teto wanted, he could tell them the reasons he had become an adventurer beyond simply earning money. Teto suddenly felt dizzy. His face turned bright red as he wondered whether he could really admit something as childish as wanting to become like the adventurers from the stories he had read. Instead, Teto asked Alvin why he had become an adventurer. Alvin admitted that it was not something he had intentionally kept secret, but it was the first time he had ever truly talked about it. After a brief silence, he explained that his family had been completely ordinary farmers, yet he had always been fascinated by adventure because an elderly former swordsman adventurer had lived nearby. Among children his age, Alvin had always been physically the strongest, and he had also possessed a large number of skills. Since he was the second son and would never inherit the family farm, becoming a swordsman had simply felt like the natural path. He smiled as he finished his story. The others all commented that his reason was surprisingly ordinary. Teto admitted he had expected something more dramatic. Melina observed that there was not even much to discuss about it, while Kokol simply remarked that Alvin had been the younger brother. Scratching his head, Alvin agreed that he really was rather ordinary. He then suggested that they take a short rest. As they relaxed together, Teto removed his boots. Alvin quietly reflected that, if they continued adventuring as this party, they might not even need an item to erase their minus skills. He wondered what each of them would choose to do if they could remove those skills. He imagined Kokol lending her abilities to a major party that specialized in clearing the most difficult quests. He wondered whether Teto would form a treasure-hunting party capable of gathering treasures more efficiently, and what sort of companions would help Melina reach even greater heights. Perhaps it would require a group of exceptionally intelligent people. As he considered the possibility of erasing his own skill and continuing on without the other three, Alvin questioned whether it would even be possible to find a party better than the one he had now. Sitting beside him, Kokol quietly glanced in his direction. At the beginning of chapter 10, Alvin recalled his childhood, when he pulled a bucket up from a well, carried it over, and poured the water into a barrel. After finishing, he reported to the old man that the task was done. The old man praised him for his hard work before telling him that the next job was cutting the grass. Alvin protested, insisting that he did not want a scythe but a sword instead. He asked the old man to hand him a sword. In response, the old man smacked him on the head with a broom and warned him not to get carried away. He explained that wielding a sword required more than arm strength. Alvin had to use his entire body, including his back, palms, legs, and abdomen, or his form would suffer. Farm work was the best way to strengthen all of those. Alvin complained that the old man only wanted to avoid doing the work himself. The old man walked away, saying he had already explained that his back was bad and that Alvin should show some respect for the elderly. Alvin knew he was lying. Every morning, the old man woke before sunrise to practice swinging his sword. Alvin silently vowed that one day he would wield a shining sword, make many friends, and set out on countless adventures. Back in the present, Alvin noticed something. Kokol was quietly humming. Although her pitch was slightly off, the rhythm was pleasant. Looking over, he saw that she had her status screen open even though she was not looking at it. He wondered what she was doing. When Kokol opened her eyes, she noticed Alvin watching her and immediately covered her mouth. Alvin apologized, wondering if he had interrupted her enjoyment. Embarrassed, Kokol wished he would pretend he had never heard it. Alvin realized she meant the humming and assured her that it was nothing to be embarrassed about. She shyly wondered whether she had been off-key. Alvin replied that it was not nearly bad enough to worry about. Alvin realized he had probably made things awkward again and searched for a way to cheer her up. As he tapped his armor, an idea came to him. He handed her a piece of candy, telling her not to worry and to sing as much as she wanted. It was a mint candy he had received for free at the canteen. Kokol's eyes sparkled. Alvin was surprised that she intended to eat it immediately. Seeing her brighten up, he felt relieved. Kokol happily popped the candy into her mouth. Alvin's gaze briefly fell upon her lips before she smiled. She explained that she was sucking on the candy because it soothed her throat. Alvin blushed and quickly looked away. Kokol then explained that the song she had been humming made her feel nostalgic because it came from her hometown. Since everyone had been talking about their hometowns earlier, it had naturally come to mind. She added that she normally counted the rhythm silently without humming aloud. Alvin then realized why she had kept her status screen open. He asked whether she had been using it to keep track of time by matching the tempo of the song, much like estimating when 10 seconds had passed without looking at a clock. Kokol confirmed that she had. She explained that she kept 1 beat per second and had practiced enough to maintain the rhythm for roughly 5 minutes. Alvin was impressed, admitting that he could not even manage 10 seconds. Kokol explained that a good sense of time was useful for maintaining a steady chanting rhythm, tracking spell durations, and handling many other aspects of magic. It varied greatly from person to person. Alvin admitted that he had never known that. Kokol said she found it easier to keep the rhythm when she matched it to a song, and that it was more enjoyable that way. Alvin agreed that it sounded like a good approach. Kokol added that, aside from practicing magic itself, this was one of the few things she could train, although she considered it a simple and rather boring subject. Alvin started to disagree, but she quickly stopped him. He admitted that, as someone who did not use magic, he was not sure he truly understood what she was doing. Kokol told him that it was all right if he did not understand. She still had a long way to go before the vanguard would ever need to pay attention to what she was doing. Alvin reflected on her words. She had said it was fine not to understand, yet he truly did not understand at all. Not even a little. Kokol quietly encouraged him to keep moving forward without worrying. She assured him that she would always keep his HP up. As Alvin looked at her, he felt that she radiated reliability from every part of her being. Melina stretched her arms and remarked that she had always thought Kokol's chanting sounded melodious. It seemed she had not been imagining it. Startled, Kokol realized that Melina had been awake. Melina explained that, unlike a healer, she had never needed to train herself to cast spells with such precise timing, so it was an honor to witness such meticulous practical application of magic up close. Alvin commented that he thought Melina was impressive as well. He considered both of them incredibly dependable. Melina thanked him and remarked that maintaining multiple buffs simultaneously while ensuring none of them expired was extremely difficult. Alvin observed that Kokol's buffs really never seemed to wear off and wondered whether they simply lasted unusually long. Melina questioned whether they did not last an average amount of time. Kokol immediately turned red before insisting that they did indeed last an entirely average amount of time and were perfectly normal for a cleric. Melina found the reaction strange, thinking it was not really the sort of information that needed to be hidden. She remarked that Kokol seemed capable of doing anything considered ordinary with remarkable ease, including fighting. Kokol denied it. Alvin pointed out that she was level 80 and had even defeated an archer goblin in a single blow. Kokol admitted that, as a cleric, she had never felt as powerless as she had when facing such an overwhelming disadvantage against that enormous horde. Alvin glanced at her. Kokol quietly added that she was still standing only because of everyone else. At that moment, Teto suddenly asked what was happening. After yawning, he wondered whether they were planning to put Kokol on the front line. Alvin replied that they were simply saying it was time to get ready to leave. He reminded Teto to tie his bootlaces properly. Teto acknowledged the reminder. The party left the safe room and continued onward. Before long, Alvin looked up at the massive door standing before them. Kokol quietly murmured that they had finally arrived. Melina wondered whether the design carved into the door might contain some kind of hint. Alvin asked everyone if he could have a moment to speak. Standing before the group, he pointed out that they had gathered a considerable number of valuable items on their journey. Considering that they had all entered the cavern of the setting sun in pursuit of the rumored reward, he believed they would receive an excellent payout from this single expedition. In that sense, he felt they could already say they had achieved their goals. Melina reminded everyone that the real reason they had come was to erase their minus skills. As she reflected on that, she remembered checking the dungeon expedition party rankings. She recalled Teto always standing alone beneath a tree, Kokol arriving by herself while carrying her belongings, and Alvin sitting alone during meals. The realization came to all of them that what they had truly wanted were friends and a party of 4 adventurers. Silence fell over the group. Alvin explained that the boss on the 40th floor would undoubtedly be extremely dangerous. He was especially concerned about the unknown trap that prevented anyone from retreating after entering the boss room. They still had several options. They could search the upper floors for additional clues about defeating the boss, return home to prepare more thoroughly before attempting the raid another day, or even sell their map and gathered information before simply waiting for the boss drop to appear on the market. With those possibilities in mind, Alvin wanted to hear everyone's opinion. The decision before them was whether to return home or challenge the boss. Kokol quietly asked what Alvin himself wanted to do. He remained silent for a moment before admitting that being with this party felt like a dream. He had finally found the very thing he had always wanted but had never been able to obtain. More than that, he had found a party even better than anything he had ever imagined. Because of that, he believed they should challenge the boss now. Their minus skills not only cancelled one another's drawbacks but also produced positive effects that could only exist with all 4 of them together. None of it would be possible if even one member were missing. The others looked at him as he waited for their answers. Melina agreed. She wanted to witness the truth behind the boss drop with her own eyes. She also had no desire to hesitate long enough for another party to claim the victory before them. Teto agreed as well. Having already searched the dungeon thoroughly, he believed they should challenge the boss using the clues they had gathered so far. Only Kokol remained. She declared that the decision was settled and that they should continue onward. Alvin asked whether she was certain. Kokol answered that she was only a healer because the party needed her. Alvin understood. Deep down, he felt that this party no longer needed to erase their minus skills. Even so, all 4 of them still wished to challenge the boss because they most likely shared the same feelings. Yet another thought crossed his mind, causing him to frown. No party lasted forever. Injuries, illness, quarrels, and recruitment by other groups were all common reasons for parties to break apart. Even if he found himself alone again, the world would continue turning, and he would still have to survive as an adventurer. Because of that, he could not help wanting to confirm the truth for himself. Even if it was only a rumor, he wanted to know whether a way to erase minus skills truly existed. With that resolve, Alvin opened the door. At the beginning of Chapter 11, the door slowly opened. Alvin stepped in first, followed by the others. He was confused by the tree standing before them and wondered where the boss was. Kokol thought that it might not have appeared yet. Suddenly, the leaves rustled and Alvin looked up in shock. The tree's fruits resembled internal organs and came in many different colors. Melina asked if Alvin had found the boss, but the moment she looked up, her jaw dropped. The sight unsettled her, while Teto thought the fruits looked like entrails, prompting Melina to wish he would stop. Alvin observed that the fruits came in all kinds of colors and types and wondered if they were truly the tree's fruit. They then noticed the door beginning to close. Alvin thought they still had time to retreat and considered leaving to use everything they had learned to revise their strategy. In the end, he decided against it. They had no reason to retreat. Their negative skills were no longer a concern, and they possessed far more skills than an ordinary party. They were as prepared as they could be. The door shut completely behind them, and they all remained where they stood. Melina realized there was no turning back now, while Alvin concluded that all they could do was defeat the boss with everything they had. Without warning, one of the tree's fruits dropped. A voice lamented, and the entire party immediately assumed fighting stances, unsure whether they were under attack. Kokol realized that the boss's name had not appeared yet and concluded that this was probably a staged scene. One fruit fell after another as the voice continued its eerie recitation about the absence of the red of blood, the yellow of shrieks, the green of alarm, the blue of waits, and the purple of despair before abruptly stopping. A woman then appeared within the tree. Alvin wondered if she was a plant-type dryad, though he had never seen one so enormous that it filled an entire room. The woman pointed upward, and Alvin wondered what she intended to do. Suddenly, an illustration appeared. Kokol believed it depicted a war, and when Teto questioned it, she recalled that the scriptures spoke of a great war fought between people long ago. Alvin wondered whether people had truly killed one another on such a massive scale. To Melina, it looked like hell itself, while Teto dismissed it as a staged scene meant only to frighten them. Melina thought it was succeeding remarkably well. The voice resumed, explaining that without the rainbow of the battlefield, she had withered so much that her fruit had faded and dulled. As the setting sun of age drew near, all that remained of her body was a hollow darkness. Even so, she could not stop painting the scenes of that horrifying war. As the woman paused, the party wondered whether the real battle was finally about to begin. She then smirked, deciding that she needed colors. Dark vapors rose from the ground. Alvin noticed that they were not taking any damage and wondered if this part was also staged. Melina questioned whether it was safe to breathe the vapor, and Kokol admitted that she did not know, though she thought it might be harmless if it was merely part of the staging. Teto interrupted with the possibility that it was actually a gimmick. Alvin reasoned that if it was a gimmick, then something must have changed. A sudden popping sound reached Alvin's ears. Melina wondered if it signaled a debuff, but Teto realized it could not be one because it would already have attached itself. Kokol grimly understood that if it was not a debuff, then her cleanse would be useless against it. Alvin had never anticipated this. He wondered if they were really expected to fight under these conditions. For processors of negative skills, people like them who possessed more skills than usual, this was the worst possible scenario. Words suddenly appeared before them, declaring that skills were unavailable. Horror spread through the party as they realized they had entered a room governed by a specific rule. They understood that this was the gimmick. The voice resumed its recitation, speaking of the crimson of blood, the amber of bellows, and the chartreuse of alarm. Melina was shocked because she had never heard of a skill restriction rule before. Kokol looked at the others before recalling that although this was also the first time she had encountered skills becoming unavailable, she had experienced something similar known as magic unavailable. The voice continued its recitation, speaking of the cerulean of Wales and the wisteria of despair. Melina wondered whether it had not been difficult for Kokol to fight without magic before. Kokol explained that it had not been, because they had been given clues before the restriction had taken effect. The voice addressed them as foolish children of man, visitors from afar who refused to shun conflict. Teto protested in frustration, unable to accept how they were supposed to deal with something like this. Kokol urged everyone to switch gears until they understood the circumstances behind the change. Alvin agreed with the idea. He realized that it was not only Melina's jealous god's blessing that had been affected, but also the skills he had originally possessed, including strength boost, high. Melina noticed that the staged scene seemed to be coming to an end. Alvin acknowledged her observation. The voice declared that their deaths would inspire her next work of art. Words appeared on the tree, revealing the boss's name as Dusk Dryad, Mural Maker. Alvin informed everyone that the battle had begun and told them to stick to the basic. Even as he said it, his sword felt unusually heavy, leaving him wondering how many levels worth of power he had lost. One of the branches bent, startling Alvin into thinking it was about to attack. Instead, one of its fruits splattered onto the ground. He realized it had never been aiming for him as the fruit transformed into heat salamanders. Alvin identified the dryad as the type that summoned ordinary monsters to fight alongside it. Teto quickly noticed that the red fruit had produced red monsters and concluded that each fruit likely summoned monsters matching its own color. Melina pointed out that there were 5 fruit colors: red, yellow, green, blue, and purple, and reasoned that, based on the flavor text, there might also be a black one somewhere. Alvin suddenly felt his abilities increase and asked if the enhancement had come from Kokol. Melina was relieved that magic was still usable. Kokol decided that she would strengthen them with as many buffs as possible. Alvin reminded her to watch her MP before realizing she did not actually need to worry about it. He ordered everyone to ignore the boss for the time being and eliminate the summoned monsters first. Alvin charged at the heat salamanders. His attacks connected successfully, and he remembered that the monster's weak point was its snout. With enough damage, he should have been able to stagger it. However, when he struck the weak point, nothing happened. He followed with a rapid series of slashes, but it still took him quite a while to bring the monster down because of how much power he had lost. Suddenly, Teto warned him about the fire. The salamander faced Alvin and launched a fireball. Alvin judged that the timing made it difficult to dodge, so he decided to knock it aside instead. He instinctively used parry, only to realize in shock that the skill no longer activated. The fireball struck him directly. As the salamander drew another breath, Alvin realized he would be unable to avoid its next attack. A dagger suddenly spun through the air and struck the salamander's snout. Teto apologized for allowing it to get so close to Alvin, admitting that his thrown daggers were not very effective against it. Alvin assured him that it had still worked. At that moment, he realized that throwing daggers was itself one of Teto's skills. Likewise, parry was one of Alvin's swordsman's skills. He had relied on it for so long that he had forgotten it was a skill at all. Ripples suddenly spread across the ground. Teto wondered if it was water. An explosion erupted beneath the salamander, launching it high into the air. Teto was astonished as it was sent flying before crashing back to the ground. Melina admitted that she had known she would not be able to launch it very far because the effects of her skills had been neutralized. Teto wondered if this rule was the reason every other party had failed. Alvin had no doubt that high-level adventurers on the lower floors relied heavily on powerful skills, and having those taken away was like clipping a bird's wings. Alvin noticed Kokol healing him. She remained just as quick with her support as ever, even while concentrating on her chant. Teto pointed out that Kokol was busy, and Alvin agreed, realizing it was thanks to her buffs that their abilities had returned to their normal values. Even so, Melina remained concerned and warned everyone to stay careful. Alvin agreed. Teto did not understand what she meant, so Melina asked how long he had been an adventurer. Teto admitted that he had spent so long adventuring alone that he knew very little about healers. Melina explained that enemies built enmity not only from damage but also from buffs and healing magic, telling him to remember that. She then warned everyone that another branch was moving. Teto finally understood. Repeatedly casting support magic would eventually become a burden by drawing the enemy's attention toward Kokol. Alvin warned the party that the next fruit was green. It produced elder mandrakes. Teto was amazed, having never known mandrakes could grow so large. Without warning, Alvin grabbed Teto and apologized before hurling him far to the rear. According to documents Alvin had read, an elder mandrake's opening roar was treated as a close-range attack. Anyone struck by it would be petrified for an instant. Immediately afterward, one of its roots slammed into Alvin and sent him crashing into the wall. He fell to the ground, realizing how difficult the battle had become. Under normal circumstances, he could have dealt with the mandrake's roar using parry. Everyone's movements were noticeably dull now. If they continued fighting as they always had while dwelling only on the abilities that had been taken from them, they were going to lose. At the beginning of Chapter 12, Alvin saw that his HP was recovering. He thought about the injury he had sustained and tried moving his body, finding that he could still move without issue. After taking the entire hit head-on and crashing straight into a wall, it was only natural that he had not escaped unscathed. Kokol asked about his injury, and Alvin assured her there was no problem, reminding her that, if nothing else, he was a tough guy. Kokol blushed, relieved, as she had been solely focused on chanting. Alvin considered that only natural since she had been making sure his HP stayed fully restored. As skilled as healers came, Kokol accepted the praise with a smile and gratitude. Alvin stepped forward and apologized to Teto for tossing him like that. Teto brushed it off, knowing he would have been flattened if he had taken the hit himself. Melina called out to check whether Alvin was all right, and he confirmed that he was. He admitted that without his weapon skills, he was not going to be doing much damage. Teto advised him to simply try everything and see what worked, explaining that it was how he handled things when fighting solo. He suggested attacking whatever looked like a weak point before kicking the mandrake, pleased when it reacted as expected. Encouraging Alvin to try anything and let loose, Teto threw a round object, then another, with the second landing directly inside the mandrake's mouth. It exploded, bringing one of them down. Alvin was impressed that Teto had incorporated an item into his attack and praised him for the clever idea. Teto reflected that he had not expected it to come in handy as a substitute for a scale, noting that it had been a simple gag idea he had come up with some time ago. With only one enemy remaining, they prepared to finish the fight. The dryad suddenly swished her finger, causing a branch to sway before dropping onto the ground. Its sticky surface transformed into vines that slithered behind Teto. Alvin noticed the danger and warned him, but the vines wrapped around Teto before he could react. Teto attempted to chant escape but was unable to activate it, and the mandrake began walking toward him. Melina fired at the mandrake, while Alvin quickly slashed through the vines. Glancing toward Teto, Alvin saw him collapse onto the ground. Everyone rushed over to him, and Teto apologized, realizing he had instinctively kept trying to use escape despite forgetting that he could not use it. Melina then noticed that the green branches were receding. She wondered if defeating the monsters that emerged from the green fruit had caused it. Kokol observed that the same thing had not happened with the red fruit, suggesting there might be a specific order or timing they needed to remember. Alvin agreed that they had better pay close attention. Looking up, they saw the next fruit resembling a brain. From the blue fruit emerged an ice golem. Teto initially thought there was only one, but Alvin immediately noticed that this golem was nothing like the ones they had faced before. It possessed ranged attacks and began firing at them. Alvin warned Teto to keep his distance. After a while, the golem stopped attacking, leading Alvin to conclude that it had only been trying to keep them away. Teto decided that he and Melina would handle it from a distance, and Alvin agreed, leaving it to them. As Teto ran off, he signaled for Alvin to take a time out. While Teto dodged the incoming attacks, Alvin reflected on those words. He had effectively been tagged out. Accepting that, he focused on reconsidering their current strategy. Now that they understood the special mechanic of the area, they obviously could not continue fighting the same way. He believed he could come up with a better approach. Even so, the entire gimmick of having skills unavailable still struck him as unreasonable. That was the only way he could describe it. He wondered whether he had overlooked any hints and recalled the substantial flavor text scattered throughout the area. That seemed like the best place to start. Thinking back, a few pieces of text stood out to Alvin. One had been at the entrance to the Cavern of the Setting Sun, and there had been another after that. He wanted to review the exact wording one more time. He remembered that Melina had been taking note. Looking ahead, he wondered whether they had already defeated the enemy. Smoke filled the area. Kokol noted that it only had a tiny bit of HP left. Teto urged everyone to keep moving. Melina ran as the golem chased her, having been certain that magic alone would be enough. Suddenly, the golem's spikes were chopped off as Alvin struck it with his sword. He told the others to leave the close-range fighting to him. The clang of his sword echoed as Kokol cast physical resistance penetration, causing the blade to glow. Alvin began slashing the golem before driving his sword into it. The golem crumbled. Melina thanked Alvin and admitted that she had miscalculated her damage. She had kept forgetting that stat-enhancing skills were unavailable as well, making the mistake all the more frustrating. Alvin told her not to worry. If one person fell short, someone else would pick up the slack. That was what a party was for. Melina was deeply moved, privately thinking that it was still amazing how Alvin could say things like that with a completely straight face. She was almost jealous. Alvin apologized before asking whether she had written down the flavor text. She confirmed that she had. He asked if he could look at the notes immediately, and she handed them over. Teto curiously wondered what was inside, joking to himself whether it contained hopes and dreams or poems. Melina dismissed the idea, thinking of it as perfectly normal personal information. Since Alvin needed it right away, she was willing to lend it to him. She had marked the relevant pages with a leaf bookmark, considering it another way of picking up the slack. Alvin appreciated the help. Melina then grimly warned him not to look at any other pages. Alvin immediately promised that he would not. Before anything else could happen, Teto warned everyone that the next branch would activate soon and that they needed to stay on guard. Even so, Melina grabbed Teto to make sure he did not peek. Alvin briefly wondered what else might be inside the notebook, before firmly telling himself not to open any other pages. He turned to the note. Earlier, he had nearly dismissed the flavor text as irrelevant because he had expected something related to items that removed skills. Instead, the relevant passages read. The old man replied, "Ai, my body is weak, my holy sword rusty, and my mind worn down from the use of magic, but my blank is still blank." Cavern of the Setting Sun. Another passage read, "A swordsman's strength to swing a sword will eventually wither away. A bowman's hawk eyes, used to see 1,000 miles, will eventually become cloudy, but that blank will continue to be honed by blank." Alvin considered the abilities that weakened with age. If the text represented the gimmick that rendered skills unavailable, then people lost their skills, their stats declined, and they became so focused on those losses that they could no longer fight properly. That perfectly described what was happening to them now, with the obvious exception of Kokol. She had been fortunate enough to keep healing him as promised, ensuring that his HP stayed topped up. The first half of the text explained their current situation, but parts of the second half were illegible. The answer had to be there. Suddenly, it felt as though he were underwater. If everything had been deliberately designed this way, he wondered what its true purpose was. Mismatched monsters grouped together only by color. A boss capable of negating their skills. The answer had to be close. The frustration weighed on him. Something important was hidden there. He could not understand why they were being tested like this. It felt as though he had sunk even deeper until someone suddenly called his name. His attention snapped back to reality. Water already covered the ground. He realized with a curse that, while he had been lost in thought, the others had come under attack from giant spiders. Teto gritted his teeth, and Kokol faced the situation with a serious expression. Alvin cursed himself, remembering that he had just been talking about picking up the slack. Then he noticed the branch above them. It was the yellow branch. Confused, he looked around and saw Kokol lying unconscious on the ground. He had no idea what had happened. Everything felt completely out of place. The giant spiders moved toward Kokol. Alvin desperately tried to stop them, urging them to stay back. In his mind, Kokol had always been at a higher level than he was. She should have been the one furthest from death, yet she was the one collapsing before his eyes. He could see her death approaching. Forcing himself to stop thinking about levels, Alvin rushed toward her. he caught her before falling to the ground with her in his arms. Teto and Melina stared in shock. Alvin felt overwhelming relief. Sitting up, he held Coco carefully. Her life felt so delicate and fragile that, at that moment, he swore he would protect her no matter what. At the beginning of Chapter 13, Alvin warned the group that the next branch was going to move soon, so they needed to stay on guard. Melina looked up and spotted another fruit. Suddenly, electric spiders skittered around them. Coco saw the large number of spiders and found them creepy. She wondered if Alvin was alright and glanced at him, noticing that he was completely absorbed in reading his note. He suddenly warned her to watch the front, but the vines attacked before she could react. She was electrocuted and could no longer move after being afflicted with paralysis. She realized the enemy had targeted her. She heard Alvin running toward her as she was thrown through the air. Even as her consciousness faded, she knew she could not fall like that. Landing on her head the wrong way would be disastrous. However, she never felt herself hit the floor. Her entire body was numb, and she could not feel anything. At that moment, Alvin was holding her. She assumed her mind was simply trying to comfort her during what she believed were her final moments. Alvin immediately opened an ochre goblin antidote, a potion that dispelled paralysis, and poured it over her. She sneezed as the paralysis wore off and regained the ability to move. Alvin called her name, making her blush. He checked whether she was alright, and she assured him that she had not suffered any serious injuries. Alvin apologized for losing focus in the middle of the fight. Coco wondered if he had been thinking about something important, but he denied it. She realized that her paralysis resistance had not worked, and that fact had completely slipped her mind. They had both made mistakes. She thought that if Alvin had only been standing there thinking about what to eat after they escaped, she would have been angry, though she accepted that it was not the case. She resolved to use paralysis resistance buffs beforehand instead of relying on cures afterward and urged Alvin to get back to the battle. He looked at her for a moment before running off. In her mind, she was relieved that he had not realized she had remained conscious the entire time. Melina called out to Coco, pointing out how close she had come to being seriously injured. Coco gave a small chuckle, already fully aware of it and feeling embarrassed enough as it was. Melina was glad that Coco was unharmed, but she also remarked that Alvin's leap to catch her had been incredible. She admitted she had simply stayed out of the way because she was afraid of interfering and ruining it. It was unfortunate that Coco had not been able to witness it herself. Surprised, Coco wondered if Melina did not think she could have done more than watch. Melina explained that if Alvin had failed to reach Coco in time, she had planned to use a small flooding spell to break the paralysis. However, Alvin had made it in time. Coco complained that Melina's method would have been too rough. Melina thought Alvin had been incredibly intense during the rescue and believed no one would have dared interfere. She guessed it was because Alvin had been rushing to save Coco and advised her to be more careful from then on. Ahead of Coco, Teto continued fighting the electric spiders, making her blush. After he killed the last one, he confirmed that all the enemies had been defeated. Alvin pointed out that the constant summons kept them so busy that they never had time to damage the main boss, adding that it would be great if they could stop the summons. Another fruit suddenly fell. This one was purple, and 3 poison steel armors appeared. At the same time, the connected branch began sliding around. It traced something before instantly pulling back. Alvin realized that some of the branches could do that. Teto guessed they had entered a poison phase. If it really was poison, it would not be much of a problem because the anti-poison potion would protect them for about another half day. Even so, they still needed to avoid the enemy's thrust attacks because they could pierce through their guard and remove half of their HP, dealing exactly 2,500 points of damage each time. Teto agreed with the plan. Alvin decided to keep 2 of the enemies occupied while Teto and Melina dealt with the remaining one. As soon as Alvin charged forward, he thought that keeping 2 monsters busy at once would normally be easy for him. However, his eyes widened when one of the enemies swung its sword, causing an explosion. The damage he received was negligible, but without his sword skills, his mobility was severely limited. He had to react 1 step faster than usual. He attempted to use his parry skill, only to remember that he could not. The enemy countered him instead, causing him to slip and fall to the ground. He forced himself onto his back despite his disorientation, trying to figure out what he could and could not do. Their swords clashed again, and the enemy countered once more. Remaining locked blade to blade was a terrible position because he had no idea where the second enemy was. He suddenly sensed the other living armor behind him and was startled when it used a thrust attack. The blade pierced him, instantly taking away more than half of his HP. Finding stable footing was difficult and he needed to move away from the poison swamp. He jumped back, only for his eyes to widen as the enemy attacked again. With his HP so low, he could not survive another direct hit. Guarding was useless because the thrust pierced through defenses. Evading again was impossible because there was no time. Healing without using a potion would also take too long. He questioned whether he would be healed in time and whether there was truly no way to escape the attack. As the enemy charged, Alvin could not help but selfishly wish that he could use parry. He had spent so long dwelling on his negative skill that he had never once appreciated how fortunate he was to possess all of his other abilities. Without his skills, he felt incapable of doing anything. He believed that it was only natural for things to end this way for him, and the hope faded from his eyes. Then a voice in his mind harshly told him to stop complaining and drill the movements into his head. Alvin steadied himself. He swung his sword as the voice instructed him to keep the blade at a shallow angle, avoid tensing his arms, move with the force of the blow, maintain his balance, shift his footing, and let his entire body move naturally. At that moment, he noticed a snowflake-shaped symbol appear. He wondered what it was but immediately forced himself not to lose focus. The living armor's weak point was the magic circle inside its torso, and he spotted it. He prepared to fend off each attack one by one before charging forward. The moment reminded him of his childhood, when his days had been filled with endless practice swings and constant scolding from his master. Back then, he had often complained about the point of practicing strange blocking angles. His master, Dolman, had angrily called him a dumbass and explained that those movements were essential for deflecting attack. Young Alvin had argued that parry could do the same thing much more easily. Dolman had replied that understanding the emotions with his own body made all the difference and repeated that Alvin needed to stop complaining and engrave the movements into himself. Young Alvin had sarcastically questioned whether it was really that simple, which only irritated Dolman further. Annoyed, Dolman had raised a broom to smack him, but young Alvin instinctively deflected it with his sword. Both of them had been surprised. Dolman had then lightly tapped Alvin on the head with the broom, impressed, and explained that this was why the motions had to be drilled into his body. Young Alvin still had not understood what he meant and had asked about it. Dolman had then pointed out that if Alvin never struck back, his opponent would simply keep attacking. He had laughed as he said it. Back in the present, the living armor crumbled into dust. Alvin realized that the voice had been right. It was not only his skills that he had been born with. He also had the weapon and experience he had earned through years of training. The last living armor approached and Alvin charged toward it. He realized that years upon years of accumulated practice had carved those movements into his body. As he severed the enemy's leg, he wondered if that was what his master had meant all along. He stepped closer to the fallen enemy and silently praised himself. Someone called out to him, but he was still trying to find the right words to describe what had just happened. His party ran over to him. Alvin asked if any of them had seen it. Melina did not understand what he meant. Teto wondered if Alvin had discovered a way to bypass the gimmick. Kokol apologized because she had been completely focused on casting area heal. Alvin realized that he had indeed been healed in time. Since none of them had seen what happened, he had no idea how to explain it. Teto urged everyone to finish the battle quickly. Kokol became concerned and wondered if Alvin had injured his arm, believing that was why he had stopped moving. Alvin looked at her before lowering his sword and turning toward the group. Smiling, he asked them to listen. They all focused their attention on him as Alvin declared that they could win the battle. The others looked at him uncertainly. At the beginning of Chapter 14, Melina noted that Alvin sounded confident, but she believed he had to realize that, despite all their struggles, they had not even managed to damage the main boss. Alvin looked up at the dryad in the tree and noticed that it showed no signs of moving. He concluded that defeating every summon produced by a fruit was likely required before the battle could progress. Looking back, he realized they had never taken a moment to pause and properly analyze the fight, which explained why they had struggled so much. He explained that being unable to use their skills had completely thrown all of them off their game. Teto agreed, recognizing that losing access to their skills was practically fatal. He reflected that they had only come this far as adventurers because having negative skills also granted them many powerful abilities in return. Alvin admitted that he had believed the same thing until now. However, he no longer thought that was true because he had not reached this point by relying solely on his inherent skills. The others fell silent as Alvin explained that becoming a better adventurer had required endless sword practice. He had constantly studied, learned everything he could, and made sure he could apply that knowledge. Smiling, he recalled that Teto had once said he was good at almost everything. Teto was caught off guard. Alvin admitted that, even so, he had always been jealous of Teto's sharp battle instincts, leaving Teto unsure how to respond. Alvin continued by explaining that Teto's ability to recognize the perfect moment to counter was not simply natural talent. It was the result of repeated trial and error, something Alvin deeply respected. He then turned his thoughts to Kokol, recognizing her incredible ability to cast many different spells with perfect timing, a skill that could never be mastered overnight. He also praised Melina for her remarkable attention to terrain and monster attack patterns, along with her vast collection of memorized spells, which required constant effort to maintain. Melina blushed, believing she had only been doing what was expected of her. Alvin reflected that their high levels, large number of memorized spells, and collection of rare items were certainly valuable assets. However, their true strength did not come from relying on inherent skills. It came from effort, study, and the abilities they had developed through their own hard work. Closing his eyes, he realized that those were their personal skills, and that was what truly made them adventurers. Thinking back to how each of them had struggled throughout the battle, Alvin believed he finally understood the meaning behind the flavor text. If the dungeon had truly been designed with intent, then the overwhelming variety of monsters and the restriction on using skills existed to test an adventurer's personal abilities. That had been the message hidden within the hints they had received from the very beginning. They had never been meant to understand it immediately because, if they had, it would no longer have been a test. The only way to overcome the dungeon's gimmick was to rely on what remained after their skills had been taken away. As he reflected on the time he had spent drowning in self-pity, he remembered questioning why he had never given up adventuring. The answer was that he had once dreamed of making many friends and going on countless adventures. He had not yet achieved what he had set out to do, so he had continued moving forward. He had kept trying and continued putting in work that he could truly be proud of. Earlier, his body had moved on its own, yet the movement had undoubtedly been the parry skill. Even though skills were supposed to be unusable, it had still responded to someone willing to put in the effort. Alvin believed that might have been the true message of the dungeon. They had been burdened with negative skills and forced to work much harder because of them. With that in mind, he believed there was no way they could lose. Silence followed. Teto was the first to agree. He believed he could easily make it down to the 50th floor, so defeating a boss on the 40th floor without relying on his skills should not be a problem. Melina agreed as well. Throughout the battle so far, there had not been anything as overwhelming as an instant kill attack. When Alvin had declared that they were going to win, she had honestly thought he had lost his mind. However, she now recognized that he had come up with a solid theory. She asked Alvin to return her notes since he had borrowed them long enough. Alvin agreed and assured her that he had not looked at any of the other pages. Kokol also agreed with Alvin and placed her trust in him. She believed that all of their effort, practice, and daily study had given them the abilities they needed. Alvin was glad that everyone now understood his thinking and urged them to get back to the fight. They turned toward the tree, but Melina stopped Alvin, believing they should discuss a plan first. Alvin looked at her as she pointed out that they still had no idea how to damage the main boss. Teto agreed and decided to test something by throwing a living armor toward the dryad. The attack failed, and the thrown enemy simply bounced off as the boss continued to ignore direct attacks. Alvin agreed that, aside from the summons, the only other targets available were the ceiling and the brush branches. He suggested attacking the brush branches instead. Melina agreed with the idea. The branches always retreated before anyone noticed them, leaving only a brief opportunity to attack. It had been natural to focus on the summons first, so their earlier approach had not been a mistake. Since the brush branches appeared to escape once the summons were defeated, they would need to ignore the summons instead. Teto recalled that the purple branch had created a poison swamp before immediately retreating. Alvin agreed and believed the purple branch had difficult timing. He thought the yellow branch should not be too troublesome as long as they maintained their resistance buff. Kokol noted that all they knew about the green branch was that it caused troublesome restraint. Melina added that they had never even seen the branches for the red or blue fruits because they had defeated those summons before the branches appeared. Alvin explained that once they defeated the summon currently on the ground, the battle would continue. He asked if everyone was ready and the other three agreed. Alvin remarked that it was fortunate they had this opportunity to discuss everything because, after this, the real battle would begin. He then stabbed the enemy. At first, nothing happened. Then Kokol noticed the main boss and realized something was changing. The dryad began speaking, and she observed that it appeared to be aging. Teto immediately called Alvin's attention upward. Alvin looked up in shock and saw that the fruits now displayed two colors at once. The green and yellow colors blended together, and the fruits cycled through all 5 main colors. He wondered if the battle had entered its next phase. Suddenly, bolts of energy appeared, followed by an electrode cactus. The party realized it combined both plant and lightning attribute. Alvin explained that the monster never moved from the spot where it appeared. It used a normal electric discharge attack, and also released a massive wave of paralyzing needles every 5 minutes. Kokol took responsibility for keeping track of the time. Alvin thanked her and explained that the cactus's body would swell like a towel before using the attack, giving them 60 seconds to prepare once that happened. Teto pointed toward the brush branches and spotted both a green one and a yellow one. Melina asked Alvin to leave the cactus to her because approaching it directly was too dangerous. Alvin agreed to leave it in her hands. After Kokol cast Paralyze Resist on the party, Alvin thanked her and rushed toward the enemy. He signaled to Teto that they would target the green branches first, and Teto acknowledged the plan. This time, the enemy failed to catch Alvin. He slashed through the branches and confirmed that they were indeed valid targets. Teto remarked that, now that they knew this, they would not even need the full 5 minutes to finish the battle. However, Alvin suddenly reconsidered and concluded that things would not be that simple. Teto looked at him in confusion. Melina wondered what was taking so long. It felt like Alvin and Teto were taking longer than expected. The branch should not have been that durable. She suspected the main boss was gradually healing it, which would explain the delay and could become a serious problem. Meanwhile, Teto realized that the tree was healing the branch and thought it was unfair. Alvin pointed out that enemies healed all the time, so it seemed fair to him. Teto wished Alvin would stop making so much sense. Alvin concluded that they simply needed to deal more damage than the healing could recover. Kokol called out that they had 30 seconds remaining. Alvin's eyes widened as he looked toward the electrode cactus and realized it was about to unleash its attack. He warned Teto to fall back and keep his guard up. Teto objected because they had already inflicted so much damage on the branch. Before they could retreat, Melina told them not to stop attacking. Alvin was surprised by her decision. As Melina counted down, the cactus released its barrage of paralyzing needles. Teto flinched, but Alvin urged him to keep attacking. A dark cylindrical barrier suddenly intercepted the barrage. Alvin realized that Melina was using gravity magic to deflect the needles away. It was a clever solution. As the needles scattered across the ground, Melina silently hoped Alvin and Teto would finish destroying the brush branch quickly. Alvin declared that there was no more time to hold back and cut through the branch. The dryad let out a screech as blood spurted from her fingers. Excited, Teto realized they had finally managed to injure the main boss. Alvin confirmed it, and the electrode cactus began disappearing. It appeared that destroying the green and yellow brush branches also eliminated their corresponding summons. Although the battle had been difficult, they were finally making progress. Teto asked what color would come next as they waited. Melina believed the next combination would be red and purple. The fruits dropped, summoning a lava scorpion with fire and poison attribute. Alvin instructed Teto to ignore the purple brush branch and the monster, focusing only on the red branch. Teto immediately agreed, and together they destroyed it almost instantly. The next combinations were blue and purple, summoning a tentacle slime, followed by green and blue, summoning a frozen treant. Teto remarked that this made it the fourth pattern and observed that keeping the enemies occupied without defeating them took quite a while. Alvin commented that things would go much faster if they could become more efficient, causing Teto to repeat the word to himself. Melina announced that the next combination would be yellow and purple. As the fruit dropped toward the floor, Teto rushed toward it before it landed. The moment it struck the ground, everyone noticed that the branch immediately retreated without summoning anything. Alvin wondered if Teto had somehow countered it. Teto realized that the fruit itself had been the weak point and that he had managed to strike it just before it landed. Alvin understood immediately and admitted that it was a hit he could never have made himself. Teto cursed as an amethyst golem appeared because he had left the purple fruit alone. They had focused on the yellow fruit instead. There was nothing they could do about it now. They were forced to rely on Kokol's physical resistance penetration buff to defeat the golem. Alvin glanced at his status screen and noticed that the buff was still active, but he was suddenly startled when it seemed to expire. Looking at Teto, he was certain they had just witnessed the magic wear off. He remembered Kokol mentioning that this type of buff normally lasted an average amount of time. Then he realized something. Kokol's buffs had never actually lasted unusually long. She had simply refreshed every single one with such perfect timing that he had never once noticed them expiring. She maintained that precision with every buff she cast. The realization amazed him. It was a level of skill beyond anything he could imagine. He decided that it was only right for him to rise to the standard she had set. Smiling with renewed determination, he asked Melina what the next fruit would be. Before she could answer, Alvin saw Melina attack immediately. She had already begun casting a spell toward the fruit still hanging in the tree. The spell sliced the fruit cleanly in half, causing Teto's eyes to widen in amazement. As the next fruit appeared, Teto declared that it was his and instantly threw his dagger at it. Alvin noticed that striking both fruits had staggered the process. Kokol pointed out that the tree had not summoned anything at all. Melina explained that hitting each fruit's weak point with its corresponding elemental weakness was enough to stagger it. Since the red fruit was naturally weak to water, she had already prepared a water spell. Alvin realized that if Melina had already been casting water magic, she had known in advance that the next fruit would be red. He wondered how she had known both where it would appear and what color it would be, but he had no idea. Melina reasoned that they could choose to fight only the monsters they held an obvious advantage against while staggering the others before they could summon anything. That way, they would never have to deal with every monster at once. Since they already had Paralyze Resist active, handling the yellow fruit was especially easy. She asked if that satisfied Alvin's desire for greater efficiency. Alvin agreed and apologized for losing focus. Teto told him to stop daydreaming because Alvin was still their main source of damage. As Alvin looked at his companions, he was pleased to see everyone finding their rhythm again. He watched them in awe. Every one of them possessed incredible skill. It was almost frightening. At the beginning of Chapter 15, the party continued fighting another wave of monsters. Teto confirmed that Paralyze Resist was still active, allowing paralysis attacks to glance right off him. After defeating the 10th enemy, Alvin remarked that they had reached a milestone and warned Teto to stay on his guard. The girls suddenly noticed something above them. Kokol warned everyone to look up as numerous fruits began falling from the tree. The Dryad declared that the vexing creatures had tested her patience long enough. Addressing the children of man as spawn of the deepest dark, she resolved to stain her hands if necessary. The ground crumbled beneath them as the tree's roots slithered across the battlefield. Teto was shocked. The Dryad announced that her brush was ready because she had found a new canvas. Her barrier cracked, and she finally joined the battle in anger. Teto pointed out that the main boss had finally entered the fight. Alvin observed that it was enormous, almost as though they were battling the entire room. Then he grinned. Now that the Dryad was active, they could finally attack the main boss directly. Alvin and Teto immediately charged toward her, with Teto taking the lead. He slashed one of the Dryad's roots and was surprised when poison spilled from the wound. Alvin remarked that it looked more like tree sap. The black liquid began rising from the cut root. Alvin watched in confusion as it took the shape of a wolf. Teto apologized, thinking he had caused it, as the sap continued transforming into a wolf, a boar, and several crows. Alvin reassured him that it was fine. The monster's dark appearance suggested they had reached the final stage. Melina then called out to Alvin and asked him to leave the flying monsters to her. Alvin agreed. Their plan was to advance toward the Dryad while keeping the number of enemies under control. Alvin and Teto cut through the monsters as they pushed forward. Alvin noted that although there were many enemies, they were not especially dangerous. He spotted an opening and saw that the Dryad was unguarded. As he swung his sword, a vine root suddenly emerged to block him. He cut through it, but black liquid flowed from the wound and quickly formed into a high demon. Alvin immediately realized that the fight was no longer just about overwhelming numbers. This enemy was a genuine threat capable of both magic and physical attack. The high demon instantly launched a spell at him. Alvin dodged and rushed in, striking it with the hilt of his sword. The demon's eyes widened as it tried to bite him, but Alvin struck it again before leaping back. He could clearly read the demon's movements. Without relying on his skills to guide him, he felt as though he had returned to the beginning of his adventuring days. All he could do now was swing his sword over and over. As he continued cutting into the demon, Alvin reminded himself to stay calm and focused. He recalled the old man and remembered the proper form as he raised his sword. Teto glanced over and noticed that every one of Alvin's attacks produced the effect of a critical hit. Teto landed critical hits from time to time himself, but he could not understand how Alvin was striking critical hits continuously. His jaw dropped in disbelief. Melina noticed Teto standing still and asked why he had stopped moving. Teto apologized and explained that something unusual was happening with Alvin. When Teto looked back toward the battle, he was struck by a shock wave. Kokol wondered what it was. Up ahead, Alvin was countering the attack with his sword. Melina warned him that he could not block it because it was a shock wave similar to one used by an abyss demon. At the same time, the attacking branches joined the assault. Melina pointed out that they absolutely could not allow those attacks to reach the back line. Alvin argued that, without their defensive skills, even the front line would not survive taking the attacks head-on. Teto stood back up with a groan and wondered how they were supposed to deal with the attacks without their defensive skills. Melina drank an MP recovery potion and reassured everyone. She recognized that the shock wave used the same tiles as a ranged shadow attack, meaning she could warn them before it struck next time. Alvin agreed that they would avoid every shock wave from then on. Before they could continue, Kokol told everyone to wait and pointed toward the main boss. The Dryad raised one of her arms, chopped off part of her own body, and the severed pieces splattered across the floor. Alvin was surprised that the Dryad had cut open its own body to create even more summons. The boss clearly wanted to keep the party at a distance. Teto observed that the Dryad itself sounded rather fragile, deciding that it would become his target. As a dark night attacked, Teto raised his guard and remarked that it was relentless. He skidded backward and concluded that reaching the boss seemed impossible, even if they managed to slip past the monsters. Melina warned that 3 shadow blasts were incoming. Alvin acknowledged the warning and allowed the wolves to pursue him. As he moved, he questioned whether reaching the boss was truly impossible. Every dungeon had its own logic, and monsters were never unbeatable. Even enemies that seemed invincible at first always had a weakness. Once someone discovered it, the solution would often seem surprisingly simple. That was the essence of strategy. Suddenly, Alvin flinched as the roots lunged toward him. One of the Dryad's many hands seized him. Shocked, he realized his HP was being drained as he was lifted off the ground. He decided to endure the attack head-on. Looking straight ahead, he was struck by a shock wave at the same time and was thrown backward. Gritting his teeth, he struggled to recover. Kokol's eyes widened, but she continued chanting while gripping her staff. The staff began to shine, and Alvin's body glowed as her magic reached him. Alvin silently apologized to Kokol. At that moment, another magic symbol appeared. Melina immediately warned Alvin that 3 more shock waves were coming and told him to get out of their path. When Alvin looked ahead, he suddenly realized the answer. By staying well outside the line of fire to avoid the attacks, he had completely overlooked something. In that brief instant, he saw the path to victory. He needed to clear the way. Instead of retreating, he walked forward. The other 3 watched in confusion and horror. Acting on instinct, Alvin lunged ahead. As a shock wave rushed toward him, he swung his sword and countered it. Without slowing down, he continued forward. A dark knight launched another attack, but Alvin dodged it and charged straight toward the dryad. He leaped high as the dryad's hands reached out to seize him, but he avoided them. Using the roots as footholds, Alvin ran toward the dryad. He swung his sword and severed one of its hands. He followed with a powerful strike, sending dark liquid gushing from the wound before attacking once more. The dryad declared that all talent would inevitably fade beneath the setting sun, yet within him remained the unwavering simplicity of a child of man. Hearing those words, Alvin remembered his old master. The old man had taught him that, although soul skills made many techniques easy to perform, they were all built upon the countless basic movements he had practiced. Sword skills were merely an extension of those fundamentals. The old man had often ruffled Alvin's hair, and reminded him that what someone had practiced and mastered would never leave them when they truly needed it. Because of that, Alvin should never neglect his daily training. Back in the present, Alvin smiled. He felt that he finally understood. In his heart, he thanked his master. At the beginning of chapter 16, Alvin was still lost in thought when someone called out to him. Kokol ran over and hugged him, overwhelmed with relief that he was alive after charging at the dryad alone. Alvin apologized for making her worry. Melina remarked that Alvin had done much more than simply worry them. Teto smiled, pleased that Alvin had landed the finishing blow. Melina observed that it appeared they had won, and Alvin agreed. Teto then asked what Alvin had done at the end of the battle. He had first countered with a parry before following up with heavy blow. Kokol also wanted to know how he had managed that when all of their skills had been sealed. Alvin explained that he would keep it simple. Even though he could not use sword skills, he could still perform the physical motion of a parry. That was all there was to it. The other 3 stared at him. Kokol felt that such a realization was an incredible discovery. Alvin did not think so, believing his master had probably already known it. Melina became curious about Alvin's master. Alvin explained that his master had been a swordsman who possessed no sword skills and was an unusual person in many ways. His master had taught him the actual physical technique for deflecting attack. The parry sword skill merely assisted the user in performing that same movement at any moment. That was how Alvin understood it. To him, sword skills were more of an aid than an expansion of one's abilities because he had already learned the technique itself. Even so, he admitted he might spend his entire life without fully understanding it. Melina admitted that she could not say she completely understood his explanation either. Teto believed he understood at least part of it. Sometimes his thunder attacks landed as critical hits when his angle and timing were perfect, or at least that was his theory. Melina had always believed critical hits were purely random. Teto disagreed, pointing out that chance alone could not explain why Alvin had been landing critical hit after critical hit during the battle. He reasoned that performing a movement flawlessly in every respect was effectively the same as activating a weapon skill, although doing so consistently would be extremely difficult. Melina then questioned what value skills even had if that were true. Alvin told her not to worry about that. Reproducing those perfect movements was incredibly difficult, and if anything, the battle had only made him appreciate the value of skills even more. Their discussion ended when they noticed the boss drop. Melina commented that it certainly looked impressive because it shone brilliantly. Kokol identified it as a bow. Teto recognized it as a rainbow bow and wondered why it had such unusual colors. Alvin jokingly questioned how a bow was supposed to erase skills. Kokol wondered if it could somehow shoot skills away. Alvin laughed at the idea. Teto insisted that Alvin should receive the drop because he had landed the finishing blow. Alvin was surprised. Thinking back, he realized that out of every boss battle he had fought, this was the first time he had personally delivered the final strike. He asked Teto and the others if they were truly certain, and they assured him they were. Alvin also wondered why everyone had stepped so far away before he picked it up. Their uncertain reaction only suggested they preferred to keep their distance. Alvin picked up the rainbow bow and noted that it was surprisingly heavy. In his opinion, it was suited for a high-level archer. It possessed impressive strength along with several powerful effects. Its status granted a small dexterity increase, fire, water, and wind attributes, and increased the effectiveness of status ailments. Teto commented that it sounded like a standard high-performance rare bow and guessed it would sell for a great deal. Suddenly, Alvin called Teto over, sighed, and asked him to equip the bow himself. After checking its status, Teto discovered that it possessed one additional weapon effect. Kokol asked what the hidden effect was. Teto revealed that it was called Skill Seal, Small. Equipping the bow would randomly disable one of the user's skills. Kokol immediately reacted, thinking the effect was terrible. Melina was equally unimpressed. When Kokol asked about it, Melina explained that valuable wands and other rare equipment occasionally came with a drawback despite their excellent stats. Teto added that such drawbacks usually only reduced one or two attributes, and he had never heard of an effect that sealed skills. Kokol remarked that they seemed to learn something new every day. Holding the bow, she realized that its true nature was simply to disable a single skill while it was equipped. Looking at her status screen, she saw that it had sealed her paralysis resistance high. Alvin repeated the result and observed that the effect was surprisingly straightforward, nothing like what he had expected. Kokol handed the rainbow bow to Melina. Melina noted that it was not a single-use consumable but a permanent drop that could be equipped repeatedly. Anyone could equip it if necessary, although actually using it as a bow was another matter. She wondered why she had never considered such an item before. After equipping it herself, she found that it had sealed her fire element enhancement. Teto observed that losing one random skill was a rather unpleasant drawback. When he equipped the bow, it sealed his agility up large. Alvin considered that if it had disabled his drop rate up, he still was not sure whether switching to a bow would ever be worthwhile. Instead, it sealed his strength up large. Melina concluded that the dream of an item capable of permanently removing negative skills would remain only a dream. Teto had been right all along. Remembering his earlier prediction, Teto admitted that he had still hoped he would be proven wrong. The group fell silent. Kokol finally remarked that everything had turned out well regardless. They had earned plenty of valuable drops, defeated the boss, and no one had been injured or killed. The expedition had been a tremendous success. She decided it was alright that no item capable of erasing skills had existed after all. After a brief pause, she quietly added that everything would be fine as long as they continued adventuring together. The other three stared at her in surprise. Kokol immediately blushed, explaining that they had all looked so discouraged. Melina disagreed, saying she would not describe it that way. If anything, she was simply frustrated that the dungeon had managed to outsmart her. Teto added that their teamwork had become so effective that splitting up now would be an enormous waste. The false rumor of an item capable of removing negative skills had brought them together and ultimately created an unbeatable party. Alvin reflected that he doubted he could ever have found another group like this or experienced adventures on the same level with anyone else. He admitted that he truly wanted to continue adventuring with this party. Hearing that, Kokol became deeply moved and began to cry. Teto then suggested that they needed a proper party name before registering at the guild. Melina proposed choosing something connected to the dungeon. Kokol suggested the Cavern of the Setting Sun, but the others felt that Setting Sun sounded a little too pessimistic. As everyone continued thinking of names, Alvin reflected on the setting sun and suddenly came up with one of his own. He suggested Daybreak. The name reminded him of the flavored text from the Starview Spring Dungeon, which had spoken of the sun setting only to rise once again. Kokol immediately liked the name. Melina felt it represented moving beyond the setting sun, while Teto believed it sounded like a name with a bright future ahead. Everyone agreed with the choice and celebrated the beginning of Daybreak. Long ago, a great sage had proclaimed that the world was a simulation. Stats and skills existed because the world was a simulation. Monsters dropped items when they were defeated because the world was a simulation. Rainbows appeared across the sky after the rain. People laughed and people cried because the world was a simulation. As they left the dungeon, Alvin reflected that he had once allowed his skills to guide and control him, yet he had ultimately surpassed them. Perhaps that was because the world was a simulation, but he no longer believed that truly mattered. Regardless of the reason, this was the world they lived in. As the four of them walked home together, they discussed where their next adventure would take them. 1 month later, the guild was filled with the chatter of adventurers. 2 women approached Alvin. One remarked that they always saw his name on the rankings, while the other excitedly mentioned that he would be challenging the Demon's Channel next and wished him success. One of them even held his hand. Flustered, Alvin quickly thanked them and expressed his appreciation. As they walked away, they quietly talked about how cool Alvin was, while also commenting that he was surprisingly naive, which they found adorable. Alvin returned to his party's table and apologized for keeping everyone waiting. Melina assured him it was not a problem since they had already secured a table. Teto immediately teased him, jokingly welcoming the celebrity and the famous leader of Daybreak, the party that had been rapidly climbing the rankings. Alvin admitted that he was already getting tired of receiving that kind of attention. Melina remarked that they really had appeared out of nowhere and rapidly climbed to the front rank. Kokol added that it was as though the world had finally recognized Alvin's true potential. She was happy for him, though she also felt a little sad. Alvin believed the attention would not last forever and thought they simply had to put up with it for the time being. He also mentioned hearing that Kokol had gained plenty of admirers herself. Kokol had no interest in entertaining any of them. Melina agreed, saying she had experienced the same thing with people from her former parties. It irritated her that they acted as though nothing had changed. The conversation shifted to former parties. Teto admitted that he had no idea where the members of his old party were now. Melina recalled that they had abandoned him to die. Teto reflected that, if they ever asked him to return, he would refuse without hesitation because they had missed their chance. Kokol laughed. Alvin then admitted that he personally hoped never to run into anyone from his previous party again. Just then, someone approached their table and called Alvin's name. Startled, Alvin looked up and saw Karen, his former party leader. Karen explained that he had finally found Alvin and wanted him to return to the party. Alvin was left speechless for a moment. Karen admitted that forcing Alvin out had been wrong and unfair. Melina quietly noted the irony of the situation. Alvin asked Karen what he wanted now and pointed out that it was obviously too late for this. Teto was impressed that Alvin had said that directly to Karen's face. Kokol shot Teto a glare. Karen suddenly grabbed Alvin's hand and confessed that the party was falling apart. He insisted it was not too late and admitted that they needed Alvin. Alvin questioned how selfish Karen could be after discarding him as though he had never mattered. The commotion drew the attention of other adventurers. Some wondered whether it was a lover's quarrel, while others recognized Alvin as a member of Daybreak. Back at the table, Melina blushed in embarrassment, insisting to herself that she was not that kind of girl. Teto apologized, remembering how angry he had been when Melina had mistaken him for a man, and admitted that he probably should have been more considerate. Melina silently resolved not to lose. Alvin had the distinct feeling that an irreversible misunderstanding had just been created. Karen explained that ever since Alvin had left, everything the party had attempted had ended in failure. Alvin understood that Karen must have gone through difficult situations and asked where the rest of the party was. Karen revealed that Mash had been injured, Rend had lost his weapon, and Sarah had declared that she would leave the party unless Alvin returned. Alvin was relieved that they were all still alive. He explained that when someone made a mistake, they first needed to figure out why it had happened. After that, they should do everything they could to improve. If they did not know how, they should study and learn. Karen insisted that he understood he had made a mistake and claimed that was exactly why he had come looking for Alvin. He once again asked Alvin to return. Alvin questioned whether Karen had been listening at all. He repeated that Karen first needed to do those things himself. Karen still failed to understand and wondered if Alvin wanted him to beg instead. Alvin firmly rejected the idea. At that moment, Melina called out to Alvin, deciding that the conversation was taking too long and announcing that the rest of the party would head out first. Teto had already grown bored of waiting. Kokol said they would be waiting for Alvin outside, and the three of them left together. Alvin pointed out to Karen that his current party was waiting for him. Karen pleaded once more, promising to accept any condition Alvin set and asking only to be told what to do. Alvin remained silent. He reflected that some things could only be achieved through natural talent, while others could only be earned through steady, dedicated effort. The skills people were born with could neither increase nor decrease. With that realization, Alvin understood what he needed to say. The answer was simple, almost too simple. Alvin called Karen's name. As Karen looked up, Alvin told him to refine the skills he already possessed and start over. With that, Alvin left to rejoin his party. Together, the four members of Daybreak wandered through the city.